Buongiorno a tutti quanti, bienvenue, dobrý den, welcome, and other varied European languages for this transnational project. I'm Steve Milner, I'm the director of the British School at Rome as of the last year and a bit. The connection with the BSR for the UNREST project dates back to my predecessor, Christopher Smith, who was instrumental in working together with Annacento Bull, quondam member of the BSR's faculty, in bringing the project and bringing this collaboration to the British School at Rome. This is the second final conference, I'm getting a bit panicked, of a large ERC project in 2 weeks. Last week we had the Rome's Mediterranean Port project, which again brought together an international scholarly community to debate the significance of the Mediterranean basin as a place of exchange, of migration, of kind of coming together, and similar issues in different time frames and maybe different critical vocabulary about issues relating to cohesion, multiculturalism, merchandise and exchange. So I'm delighted to welcome you all here for this final conference of the UNREST research programme, which is decidedly European in focus, talking about cohesion in the current context whilst representing a British entity overseas in mainland Europe, brings with it its own unknowns. Suffice to say, we remain. There's no sense in which the British School at Rome shuts and withdraws back over the other side of the protection of the English Channel. We remain and will remain avidly pro-European at the heart of Europe, bringing UK researchers and Commonwealth researchers to what is an incredibly important, not just the capital city of a nation state, but a really important nodal point for the discussion of some of the issues that you are talking about today. Rome boasts a very strong UN agency-based representation here, together with other agencies, international agencies like ICOM, looking at issues to do with social cohesion and the curation of cultural heritage across conflict sites, who we're also working with, as well as the European Space Agency, who are now doing increasing amounts of work in terms of actually looking from space down to Earth to track the impact of conflict and the ways in which we can kind of intervene to try and protect aspects of cultural heritage. So a lot of agencies now are pointing their attention that are based in Rome at issues which are issues that you're going to be looking at today, and which we hope, aspire, and will keep working to talk about ourselves at the British School at Rome, and also in collaboration with our other the other British international research institutes, the BIRI Consortium. So we've just received funding from the British Academy to do 3 events next year as part of a research network on the British Academy's research theme of utopia and dystopia, Imagine Futures, which also talks to issues of memorialisation, but also significantly the whole question of future memory. How can we seek to condition or ask people about the ways in which they would like to almost preempt their own memorialisation through forms of recording and securing a memory of a future to avoid forgetting. I was involved indirectly through the big AHRC project that was based in Hull recently on the Remember Me, the changing face of memorialisation, which was very much more focused on British forms of memorialisation practice, doing lots of fieldwork interviews with people attending memorialisation events for the First World War back in the UK. And this project seems to kind of extend that out to a much broader transnational perspective. So I'm really, really glad you're here. I do hope that we can find reasons to pull you back in terms of what we do and the activities that we're involved in. We're resolutely remaining where we are, but we're talking to everybody and having an event like this which brings people from all corners of the earth and from multiple nations to debate important contemporary issues which are very germane to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and issues around social cohesion is the vital part of the kind of work that we have to carry on doing, because it has a massive importance. At which point I'm going to pass you over to my former colleague from the University of Manchester, who lived 2 doors down from me on the same corridor, Professor Stefan Berger, and I wish you happy proceedings, and I will try and attend as much as I can over the course of the next 2 days, meetings permitting. So welcome and thank you.
A very warm welcome also from me. It's great to see so many people here, and let me first of all thank Steve Milner, the director of the British School at Rome, for his warm words of welcome, and of course also for his hospitality here in Rome, in this wonderful location, in a city that is of course rich in wonderful locations. It's great to be here. Well, I mean, it's hard to believe, but the project UNREST is coming almost to an end, and we have been working in it for the best part of 3 years, which seems again hard to believe. I think everyone inside the UNREST project is looking forward very much to the next 1.5 days, discussing with a whole host of people who have not been so centrally involved in the project what we think are the results of that project. And of course, we are delighted that all of our guests have accepted our invitations and have come to Rome, and we look forward very much to their comments over the next 1.5 days. The UNREST project started from the assumption that the cohesion within Europe, within the European Union, was under threat, that it was under threat from a range of right-wing populist movements who were busy undermining the European project and busy popularizing strong nationalist, xenophobic, ethnocentric and authoritarian and essentially non-democratic forms of politics within the European Union. In the realm of memory, they have been reviving a range of antagonistic forms of memory. Antagonistic forms of memory, we will hear more of that in due course, that posit an us, a national us, against a kind of foreign them that is extremely monologic and homogenizing and has been successful in mobilizing the passions of national belonging that at least some of us thought belonged firmly into the 19th century, but we all had to learn that they also still belong to the 21st centuries. So these forms of antagonistic memory have been attacking forms that we in the project have called cosmopolitan memory that we strongly associate with the memory politics of the European Union, but also, of course, with the memory politics, with the more mainstream memory politics within many of the EU's nation states, at least during the Cold War. These kind of cosmopolitan memory frames also still very much operated along us versus them dichotomy, but it was no longer the national against the foreign, but more the democratic against the totalitarian. That kind of cosmopolitan memory was more victim-oriented, it was more self-reflexive, it was more dialogic, but it was definitely aimed at creating a consensus that would gel around identification with the victims of totalitarianism during Europe's 20th century. It also mobilized passions, but it was a passion of empathy with the victims of those diverse totalitarianisms. So I think cosmopolitan memory was in many respects a huge step forward from the antagonistic memory regimes that dominated Europe's 19th century. Therefore, cosmopolitan memory should also not be dismissed lightly, but our assumption within the project was very much that this cosmopolitan memory had failed to engage with the antagonistic, right-wing, populist memory that has been so successful over the last decades. And therefore, we proposed a third form of memory regime, which we call agonistic memory. And of course, all of you will know that this goes back to a seminal article that Anna Centobull and Hans-Lauge Hansen published in Memory Studies, was it in 2016? 2016, so, which is called On Agonistic Memory, and it draws on Chantal Mouffe's conceptualization of agonism and tries to make that idea, Mouffe's idea of agonism, fruitful for memory studies. We will hear more about agonistic memory in the course of this conference, but perhaps just very briefly by way of introduction, I guess some of the key ideas are that it replaces the strong us versus them dichotomy that was inherent both in antagonistic and in cosmopolitan memory with a form of radical historization, of contextualization, of understanding historical actors, and not just victims, but also perpetrators and bystanders. It is based on the assumption that dialogue will not produce closure, that there will not be consensus, but that, if you like, dialogue always has to be open-ended. Of course, it also has to be self-reflexive. Of course, it has to be multivocal. But I guess the non-acceptance of closure is one way of repoliticizing memory, with the assumption that cosmopolitan forms of memory have in fact perhaps unwittingly or unwillingly depoliticized memory by producing closure, by, in a way, pretending to have reached consensus. And the idea of agonistic memory was to repoliticize memory, to allow political debate, to allow political conflict, and allowing political conflict would also mean being better able to engage with the right-wing populist movements that were behind the revival of antagonistic memory. But to engage with the right-wing populist movement in order to defeat it and not to legitimate it. So, if you like, agonistic memory is about bringing more voices into the debate, including the voices from the right. But ultimately, I think agonistic memory is about giving a stronger voice to the left in Europe, and therefore engaging with the right in order to defeat the right would be one way, I think, of describing what agonistic memory is about. And if I say a stronger voice for the left, I think I also mean an anti-capitalist left, because I think the anti-capitalist left has been more or less taken out of the consensus that has been produced by cosmopolitan memory as well. And I think that, as far as I understand it at least, is also what Mouffe is very much about, of giving a voice to an anti-capitalist left that has been more or less frozen out of the consensus, frozen out of the neoliberal consensus that has dominated politics from right-wing parties to social democratic parties over the last 30 years or so. So there is a kind of left-wing normativity, I think, inherent in agonism. And although I'm not sure that I really speak for everyone in the project when saying that, I think it's very important to stress that left-wing normativity behind the theory of agonism and of agonistic memory. We wanted to develop the theory of agonistic memory further through empirical research in the project. Empirical research on war museums on the one hand, and empirical research on excavations of remains, human bodies killed in war and civil war. And we again will talk much more about this during this final conference. But I think what I want to highlight already here in the introduction is that perhaps contrary to our initial hypothesis in the project, we actually did not find, I think, the complete dominance of cosmopolitan memory that we started off with, but what we did find, in fact, were a lot of remnants of antagonistic memory in Europe, so that in some respects we have the impression that the fault lines in European memory to some extent are still between antagonistic memory and cosmopolitan memory, with at best some faint glimpses of agonism present, at least in our empirical surveys of museums and excavations of human bodies. We also wanted to put agonistic theory into practice through commissioning a theater play. We did this in conjunction with a Spanish theater company, Micomicon, and also curating an exhibition in conjunction with the Ruhr Museum in Essen. And I should point out that for that exhibition we also developed some games which are part and parcel of the exhibition, but people attending this conference can also try out these games outside because they're there for you to play with in the various breaks of this conference. And also I think outside we have educational packages in relation to the play. So please use these things which are just outside here in the room to see what you make of these attempts to put agonistic memory into practice. I think what I would like to highlight by way of introduction is how difficult it has been to neatly delineate cosmopolitan forms of memory from agonistic forms of memory when we were trying to put agonistic theory into practice, both in terms of the theater play and in terms of the exhibition. It seems to me that cosmopolitan and agonistic memory often were connected, intertwined, allied, in conversation with each other, rather than mirror opposites. Hence, I think it is perhaps not surprising that both the play and the exhibition ultimately ended up containing a mixture of cosmopolitan and agonistic elements. Perhaps, therefore, agonism is more of a supplement to cosmopolitanism than a radical other. In the presence of so much antagonism in Europe today, it would appear to me, at least, and again, I'm sort of not sure I'm speaking for everyone in the project here, but it would appear to me to be dangerous to throw out the baby with the bathwater and get rid of cosmopolitanism altogether. Rather, it seems to me it might be worthwhile rethinking cosmopolitan memory and cosmopolitanism in an agonistic mode. And of course, I think we will have to recognize that cosmopolitanism never was a uniform memory regime. There are worlds that differentiate, say, Jürgen Habermas's conception of cosmopolitanism from the one put forward, for example, by Paul Gilroy and his notion of post-colonial cosmopolitanism. So I think perhaps from where I am standing, we need to think less of replacing cosmopolitan memory with agonistic memory and we need to think more about ways in which both memory regimes could be thought of as being part and parcel of the same project. And I think, again, from where I'm standing, the last 3 years have also shown the limits of agonism. First of all, as Mouffe herself says, agonism only works in a democratic polity. It's not possible to work agonism in dictatorships or authoritarian regimes. But I think there are also limits about who can take part in an agonistic discourse. It cannot be a free-for-all. First of all, everyone who wants to take part in agonistic discourses needs to accept the democratic polity and its rules. That is absolutely paramount. But I think there are also other limits of who can be part of an agonistic discourse. People who consciously put forward historical lies cannot be part of an agonistic discourse. Holocaust denial, for example, cannot be part of an agonistic discourse. Also, those who glorify violence in the past, genocide, ethnic cleansing, they again cannot be part of an agonistic discourse. Agonistic discourses should be about understanding why people promote or have promoted violence in the past and understanding the motivations of perpetrators in the past. But I think it is important not to allow them into an actual discourse, not to engage with them in discourse. Ultimately, I think we do not want to talk to fascists. So the aim, let's not forget, the aim of a project like ours, I think it is an aim that we all started off with, an aim that was clearly formulated in the proposal, was to find ways of strengthening social cohesion in Europe today, in defeating the populist right and giving the left a stronger voice in memory politics and in politics more generally. I very much look forward to the presentations of the results and also, of course, to the comments from outside of the project and hopefully also to constructive and, not the least, agonistic discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. My name is Lauge Hansen. I'm a professor from University of Aarhus, Denmark. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this conference. Thank you to the institution, this wonderful place. Thank you especially to Professor Natan Sznaider for coming here and acting as a discussant for this presentation, and as I understand it, also as a moderator of the discussion afterwards. The presentation is actually a presentation of the question understanding agonistic memory. And the structure is divided in 3 parts. The understanding of agonistic memory by myself, agonism in relation to other modes of remembering, Paco Colom from the CSIC in Spain, and learning from the case studies by Anstett from the University of Bath. For practical reasons, I will present all 3 parts so that we can have time for discussion afterwards. We think that that will be the most important and enriching part of this presentation. In respect for my co-presenters or co-authors of this presentation, I will read the text. So, the discussion about European and Western democracy as Stefan argued, has since the 1990s, to a large extent, been concentrated on the relation between deliberative and radical democracy. The way societies relate to the past, and especially the way contemporary societies relate to the conflicts of the past, is an important parameter of evaluation of how democracy works. And since the concept of agonism is an important concept behind the theories of radical democracy, we have, in UNREST, asked what an agonistic mode of remembering of the conflicts of the past would look like in different settings. The concept of agonism has been subjected to many different interpretations. We have some of them here. However, as the UNREST project is dedicated to the memory of conflicts, we decided from the start to take our point of departure in Chantal Mouffe's interpretation, because the world, according to Mouffe, is conflictive. In her view, society is composed of asymmetric power relations, and collective identities are constructed through the political relation between an us and a constitutive outside in the form of an other. Collective identities are therefore always already inscribed in potentially antagonistic relations. For Mouffe, the concept of agonism is mainly a quality related to the political public sphere as a way to recognize, but also to mitigate antagonism. This has two consequences. Firstly, an agonistic approach to the uses of the past will have to oppose or unsettle hegemonic ways of understanding, as well as reveal the socio-political struggles characterizing the public sphere both in the past and in the present. This is an entirely relational definition, and any kind of discourse that disrupts or unsettles hegemonic discourse could be said to have an agonistic function in this sense, including the far right. Secondly, an agonistic approach is supposed to mitigate or sidestep the antagonistic disposition for violent conflict inherently related to the asymmetric power relations. This definition is not entirely relational, but a definition of what we could call the minimum defining traits of agonistic discourse. Mouffe herself mentions the defense of equality and democratic processes, and she favors the expression that agonism is characterized by a relation of conflictual consensus between the parties, a relation where the opponent is recognized not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an adversary. But what does that mean in relation to memory of conflicts? Anna and myself borrowed the concept of mode from Astrid Erl's narrative modes of remembering and applied it to the ethical political ways in which discourses on the conflict of the past are able to construe identity positions. In our article, we claim that the three basic parameters of distinction to take into consideration, it is possible to distinguish between three and only three generic or ideal types of modes of remembering. And the parameters are conflictivity, morality, and reflexivity. An antagonistic mode of remembering, as Stefan told us, recognizes the conflictive character of society, and it depicts the other as an enemy to be destroyed. It applies the moral categories of good and evil to the agents involved in the narrative, and as identities are morally essentialized, it cannot reflect upon its own constitutive role in the construction of identity. The cosmopolitan mode of remembering builds on an understanding of the world as one big and potentially harmonious entity, united by a common culture based on the recognition of human rights. The moral categories of good and evil are applied to abstract systems as democracy or dictatorship, and the cosmopolitan mode is highly self-reflexive. Finally, the agonistic modes of remembering, as an ideal type, also recognizes the fundamentally conflictive character of society, but it tries to deconstruct the moral pitting of the other as an enemy on moral grounds through the social and political contextualization of the historical conflict. Finally, an agonistic mode of remembering is also highly conscious of its own responsibility as a social discourse in the construction, not only of the identity of the we position, but also of the adversary. So, what does it mean to treat the perpetrators of violent conflict of the past as adversaries in an agonistic sense? Do we have to understand the Nazi perpetrators responsible for the Holocaust? Yes and no. Yes, because we need to understand what kind of social and political condition it takes to make normal people turn into war criminals, believing they are doing the right thing. If we don't, we are not capable of seeing the same conditions emerge in contemporary society. And no, because we cannot allow this understanding to become an excuse or legitimation of the crimes committed. So how do we ensure this? There are probably many different ways to do it, but one particular way we have pursued in this project is through what we would call radical multi-perspectivism. Multi-perspectivism, as defined by Al, is the fact that the narrative is simultaneously focalized through different subject positions. If we combine this concept with the basic distinction of the ethico-political relation between us and them, we are able to distinguish between consensual and radical multi-perspectivism. In consensual multi-perspectivism, voices, perspectives, and perspectives belonging to the characters that basically agree, or at least believe in the possibility of rational consensus, coincide. In radical multi-perspectivism, voices and perspectives belonging to antagonistically opposed enemies, typically victims and perpetrators, meet alongside those by bystanders, traitors, collaborators, etc. Second part, agonism in relation to other modes of remembering. However, it is, as it is often the case with logical systems and abstract categorizations, they tend to fall short when confronted with reality. One of our first conclusions was the need to make our categories more fluid and dynamic and not to conceive them as enclosed memory regimes. Whereas the types of institutionalized narratives and agencies that can be associated to antagonistic and cosmopolitan memory tend to be stable, agonism has a more recognizably relational character. Such a relational character, however, is in the last instance conditioned by the changing structure of the social and political struggles in which memory conflicts are embedded. This means that there's no intrinsically agonistic repertoire of memories, actions, or emotions, but rather an agonistic pathos. A pathos that contextually shapes such items according to some formal features. Agonistic memory is not only linked to radical multi-perspectivism, but to a counter-hegemonic purpose as well. This anti-hegemonic component is a response to the structural inequalities of power that the other modes of remembering do not necessarily reflect or portray in the same way. The memories of the victors of a conflict will not be the same as those of the defeated and victimized, but an agonistic mode of remembering will not misdirect the emotions aroused by their recollection towards an essentialized antagonist. Agonistic memory must be able to include a multiplicity of perspectives that repeatedly generate controversiality as a way to politicize and bring into question the hegemonic interpretations of the past and the essentialized construction of the us-them distinction. One important issue is then how to approach the transit from antagonistic and cosmopolitan modes of remembering to agonistic ones, so that the unsettling effects of agonistic interventions can produce a contextualized understanding of the circumstances under which the traumatic conflicts of the past took place. This new understanding is mediated by the social and political context within which it is generated. Through the analysis of the viewer's reactions to the different cultural products and the ethnography of the exhumation movements, in Unrest, we have tried to identify the main emotions associated with the different modes of remembering. Whereas indignation and hope are recognizably related to agonism, hatred and fear typically characterize antagonistic memory, and compassion and sorrow refer to the cosmopolitan approach to a traumatic past. There are many other emotions involved with a potential though, like solidarity, reparation, empathy, resentment, pride, etc. And their relation to the different modes of remembering is not cast in iron. The emotional dimension of agonistic memory is ultimately connected to the conditions under which the social and intergenerational transmission of trauma takes place. Cosmopolitan memory is marked in this sense by a strong therapeutic approach. Unlike agonistic memory's open-ended conception of social and political conflict, cosmopolitan memory typically seeks some sort of healing, reconciliation, and closure of the trauma through a process of transitional justice. The difference between historical or personal trauma with its clinical implications for the subjects and structural or culturally constructed trauma is certainly relevant, but their cosmopolitan therapeutic representation, both types share a common drive to deconflictualize and therefore to privatize and depoliticize memory. On the contrary, when a historical trauma has been silenced, or its closure cannot be achieved because it's been refused or left essentially open, the spectrum of possibilities leads in many cases to agonistic experiences. As in the former examples, the political shaping of agonistic emotions depends on a liquid, contextualized process of political learning by the memory agents involved and their capacity to establish plural alliances. This is a field of agonistic memory that deserves further exploration and offers multiple research opportunities for the future. So, last part, learning from the UNREST case studies. We opted for 2 case studies, one focusing on social agents and modes of remembering relating to mass grave exhumations in Spain, Poland, and Bosnia, the other on museal approaches and modes of representation in 5 European war museums. So, first, exhumations. The first case study brought to light the relational character of agonism in a socio-political context. Specifically, it showed us that the different modes of remembering can be adopted in order to disrupt a hegemonic memory discourse, and their degree of success will depend on 1, the specific mode that characterizes the dominant discourse. Secondly, the level of contestation permitted in a specific context. And thirdly, the strategies and alliances social agents choose to develop. Thus, in Spain, as the dominant post-Franco discourse was one of forgetting, promoting mass exhumations to reopen the issue of the Civil War and the mass extermination of Republicans was in itself and anti-hegemonic disruption. In the post-Franco climate, victims' associations adopting a cosmopolitan mode proved more adept in establishing transnational links and obtaining international resonance and support than those which adopted an antagonistic mode. We thus recognize that agonism in the sense of anti-hegemonic contestation was in Spain relational, and it developed despite the absence of social agents adopting an explicitly agonistic mode of remembering. However, once the cosmopolitan discourse established itself as a prominent discourse, as the hegemonic discourse, it started to develop antagonistic traits. In some cases, stifling further contestation over the memory of the Civil War. This has two implications. First, that the cosmopolitan mode has problems recognizing the contingency and plurality of its own constructed we. Second, that it is important to develop elements of an agonistic mode as soon as possible after the end of a conflict, so as to prevent any closing up of social and cultural space for debate and contestation. This we would advocate even while we acknowledge the challenges promoting agonistic intervention in a post-conflict case such as Bosnia, given the risk of a return to antagonism. Second case, the museums. Our second case study confirmed one of our hypotheses, namely that a cosmopolitan approach to war and conflict in museum settings has become widespread in the European context, albeit often mingled with traditional antagonistic representations. More rarely, we found examples of agonistic interventions. This case study helped us distinguish between agonistic interventions and agonistic memory discourse. Single agonistic interventions such as provocative art installations, side-by-side representation of contrasting war myth, or indeed thought-provoking displays of beautifully crafted yet deadly war objects can effectively unsettle visitors and disrupt hegemonic discourses. However, they cannot in themselves provide radical multiperspectivism in the sense of helping visitors understand the historical conditions, social grievances, and political passions that made ordinary people turn into perpetrators, bystanders, or collaborators. As Steen has argued in relation to the statues of former perpetrators, it should not be a question of choosing whether to tear them down or to modify them, but of adopting a multi-layered, thoroughgoing, and complex approach. In a museal setting, this would mean complementing single provocative agonistic interventions relying on art installation or authentic objects with narrative-based radical perspectives on past conflicts, for instance, through oral history-telling. Chris Reynolds will tell us tomorrow about his successful use of oral narratives in providing contrasting perspectives on 1968 and the Troubles in Northern Ireland. As museums do not operate in a vacuum, but are heavily influenced by political and even diplomatic constraints, we found that this helps to explain the scarcity of agonistic approaches in such institutions and the propensity to opt for consensual as opposed to radical multiperspectivism. On the other hand, we agree with Move that despite being mainstream and established institutions whose role is still to represent hegemonic memory cultures, museums are also affected by social movement and protests at local, national, and transnational levels, and should therefore continue to be targeted together with public monuments and statues in order to promote agonistic representations. Finally, it is important to understand visitors' and audiences' emotional and cognitive reactions to agonistic, but also to cosmopolitan memory products. Our evaluation analysis is still ongoing, but preliminary findings indicate that a cosmopolitan representation of war can successfully inspire strong revulsion to bloody conflicts and compassion for the other among the visitors. This is highly relevant since visitors need to care and empathize about what happened in the past if they are to engage with deeper understanding of the dynamics of collective struggles and conflicts at different historical periods. Yet, as our visitors' surveys at one World War I museum clearly indicated, such feelings tend to be generic and superficial, unable to, as such, to promote understanding of the other's perspectives, or indeed the struggles and passions leading to conflict. Hence, we welcomed reactions for both cosmopolitans and agonists, but from an agonistic point of view, they can be effective only insofar as they facilitate visitors' engagement with radical multi-perspectivism and socio-political passions. Our preliminary evaluation of audiences' reactions to the theater play, carried out by Diana Gonzalez, confirms this. As she argues, the representation of a perpetrator character in a play, even though portrayed in a cosmopolitan mode, was able to unsettle spectators at the emotional level, eliciting feelings of moral revulsion. Subsequently, these feelings generated further re-elaboration, leading to agonistic reflections and passions. We might say that the cosmopolitan memory mode provides a good starting point in terms of its effects on stakeholders, but falls short of promoting complex understanding of the conflictual constructions of the collective we and they identities underpinning violent antagonism, as well as of what is required to turn enemies into adversaries. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Natan Sznaider. I'm about to respond to this paper, but I'm also the moderator of this session, so I just wanted you to adjust your clocks, and we are running late a little bit, about half an hour, so the whole program will run late, about 30 minutes or so. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to respond to this paper. I don't take this invitation very lightly. I'm not part of the UNREST program. I'm also a proud cosmopolitan. So it's a very cosmopolitan thing to do to invite me and throw in some noise into the consensus of agonism. So if you're attacked as a cosmopolitan, I think you have to defend yourself as a cosmopolitan. And this is what I'm about to do, and if it pleases the court. Now, let me say at the outset that I have nothing against the concept of agonism, but I have read with quite some agony, even antagonism, the misunderstandings regarding cosmopolitanism. I do not think that these misunderstandings are arbitrary. They do have a genealogy, and I will talk a little bit about that genealogy. My remarks will be rather agonistic in the classic sense of the term, namely a contest of ideas. Now, in the summer of 2017, if you remember, then Donald Trump's advisor, Stephen Miller, accused the CNN correspondent, Jim Acosta, who is of Cuban background, to harbor cosmopolitan bias. And no, Miller didn't refer to the famous cocktail we often see on American TV shows. Now, when the people around Trump accuse somebody of being a cosmopolitan, they usually mean that they're elitist, but elitist with a sinister purpose. Now, that reminded me of a quote of Thomas Paine from the 18th century. And I quote him from his book, The Rights of Man. "The world is my country, all mankind are my brethren, and to do good is my religion." In this context, cosmopolitans are do-gooding but bad people, for the Trumpists, who do not see their country as their country and only their fellow citizens as their brethren. In addition, I remember, of course, the raging of Le Pen against a corrupt cosmopolitan oligarchy. But we are not talking about Trumpists here alone and other right-wing populists here. The word cosmopolitan has been used by Stalin as a fighting term since the end of World War II. So to quote Joseph Stalin from a speech he gave on Soviet art and culture in 1946, and I quote him, "Recently, a dangerous tendency seems to be in some of the literary works emanating under the pernicious influence of the West and brought about by the subversive activities of the foreign intelligence. Frequently in the pages of Soviet literary journals, works are found where Soviet people, builders of communism, are shown in pathetic and ludicrous forms. The positive Soviet hero is derided and inferior before all things foreign and cosmopolitanism that we all fought against from the time of Lenin. Characteristic of the political leftovers is many times applauded. In the theater, it seems that Soviet plays are pushed aside by plays from foreign bourgeois authors. The same thing is starting to happen in Soviet films." Now, this speech providing the starting shot of the anti-cosmopolitan campaign at the Soviet bloc directed towards Jews and other ethnic minorities. Thus, you can see the critics of cosmopolitanism come from both the left and the right. Therefore, we see similar tendencies in anti-cosmopolitan campaigns in Russia, Poland, Hungary, Israel, you name it. Not only there, just think of the Brexit vote a while ago. Now, put the adjective rootless in front of cosmopolitanism, you start playing a game played very skillfully by Bolsheviks and fascists alike. Stalin has inherited his disdain for cosmopolitanism from Tsarist times, where it was a code name for Jews. Moreover, Putin continued this tendency in his rhetoric against the West until today. Putin just read some of Alexander Dugin's speeches against Western liberalism and his favorite quotings of Chantal Mouffe's work. Furthermore, these anti-liberal rhetoric coming from the left as well as from the right do identify cosmopolitanism with market capitalism and bourgeois class interest, something, of course, good populists are against. Now, we academics are not occupied with such political name-dropping, so I'm not saying that this is what is going on here, but I could not help the associations while reading the paper before that we heard. Next point which comes to my mind, reading through the paper on agonal memory, is the following. I've always been interested in agonality since I've done a bit of work on Hannah Arendt and her political theory. It never occurred to me that agonism and cosmopolitanism are on some kind of antagonistic collision course. Actually, in my opinion, quite the opposite is the case. I do come from sociology, and especially the sociology of knowledge, and I use frameworks of the sociology of knowledge for the analysis of transitional justice and memory processes. My conclusion that I have reached together with my co-authors Dani Levy in the past, Alejandro Baer in the present, and our work on Argentina, Spain, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Israel, USA, is that agonality and synthesis are actually completing and defining each other. In our sociological studies on memory politics and memory activism, it became always clear to us that the existential connectedness of thinking has to lead to ideological contestation. That's very clear. Just see the recent book that Alejandro Baer and I co-wrote together on Spain, Argentina, and Ukraine. Especially when you talk about memory, you talk about the contest, meaning the agon of worldviews, and how people think and interpret the past. Clearly, there's no unitary or uniform worldview, but only various descriptions of reality. Whoever claimed otherwise. Thus, I will talk a bit about the sociology of knowledge in its relationship to agonistic political processes, and then see its connection to transitional justice. The sociology of knowledge is an attempt to find new foundations for knowledge, when the shifting of foundations had made everything seems relative. It started with a simple but central proposition. The ultimate foundations of knowledge are sociological. Therefore, talking about memory, you talk about a plurality of knowledge. Fair enough, but that's not enough. As intellectuals and scholars, we are somehow obligated to work at the same time towards a synthesis. Otherwise, we will be just caught up in the same dichotomies we analyze and criticize. And this is exactly what cosmopolitan thinking means. It tries to synthesize various structures of thought. In my opinion, this is what agonality actually means, coming from the ancient Greek concept of contest. Through contest, you constantly reach a new synthesis. This is what good agonality is all about. It is cosmopolitan and is different, in my opinion, from bad agonality, which was developed by thinkers like Carl Schmitt and Chantal Mouffe, who I take as examples of two thinkers rejecting liberal and pluralist thinking from the right, as well as from the left. Now, there's nothing wrong with it. You can be an anti-liberal, you can be an anti-cosmopolitan, you can be a populist from the right, you can be a populist from the left. Nothing wrong with it, but just be aware who your bedfellows are when you use concepts like that in a lightweight way. Cosmopolitan, on the other hand, means to be open to experimental life. It is a shining word, I agree, a promise of a better world, a dream not yet come true. It has the sound of ancient Greeks celebrating the collapse of the old polis and the opening of new political spaces. It has the sound of the age of empire, where citizenship cannot be bound to small entities anymore. To become citizens of the world became the new calling of the ancient elite. But it also has the sound of disengagement, of a radical individualism, not bound to group and otherity, a fellowship of like-minded women and men pursuing their happiness beyond any kind of belonging. To be at home in the world, this is what it means to be intellectual, despairing at the narrowness of his or her surroundings. I'm also sure there are many reasons to be against it, because cosmopolitanism also sounds like the Enlightenment of the 18th century, the expansion of markets and moral sentiments, expansion of reason and moral will. In short, cosmopolitanism is the victory of mind over matter, the imagining of a better world where people crisscross without border posts, without passports, where everybody acts independently in a peaceful world. A world of yesterday turned into a utopian future and reclaimed by social thinkers, elevating homelessness, fluidity, liquidity, fixity to new heights. Cosmopolitanism has the sound of nobility in a plebeian age, the nobleness of Kant in a postmodern time. This is exactly what thinkers coming from the right or the left, like Schmitt and Mouffe, cannot stand. But that's the rumor also about cosmopolitanism. Much more complicated when you do not cosmopolitan normative philosophy, but cosmopolitan sociology. And when it comes to memory, I think we need a concept here of a public sphere where divisions can unite and where indifference and social distance can contribute to society's integration. Again, this jives with good agonism as well. Cosmopolitans recognize, of course, that the key to squaring the circle is to realize that the soul of politics is conflict. This is no invention of agonist theory, but that at the same time, the soul of social life is the production of common norms. Thus, what we need is an explanation how public conflict can be the key to integration, how the clash of conflicting norms can deepen our common norms and make them stronger. This brings us back to the old classics of sociology, which understood this quite clearly. People like Georg Simmel, Karl Mannheim, Louis Koser, and others. Let us take, for instance, a book published in 1954, the year I was born, Conflict, Functionalism by Louis Koser, a good old classic in classic sociological theory. Koser argues in 1954 that when there are only one, two, or three divisions in society, they cut deep. Loyalties are strong, and therefore antagonisms are just as strong. However, when there are numerous divisions, each of them commands a smaller, more fragmented group loyalty and is opposed by a disorganized and therefore milder opposition. Societies cohere because the overall tension has been lessened. This is one reason why a free press and a freely elected parliament in which all parties participate is less likely to lead a revolution than the oppression of all dissent, a nightmare from leftist and right-wing populists. From the individual perspective, not only do people in such a society find they have several overlapping identities, but it is easier for them to choose new groups to belong to. In a polarized society, one takes up a taste associated with the class or religious or generational enemy at the risk of being ostracized by one's friends. In such a world, many identities the individual might find satisfying are ringed with taboo. In a society cut by thousands of little divisions, the force of taboo is much lessened. It is easy to mix and match, to discover personal taste, never would have discovered without experiment, and never would have experimented if it counted as costly transgression. Consequently, such a society fosters individuation. And moreover, such individuation fosters personal ties that reach across and further knit together social divisions. This is how memory in modern societies works. Thus, the whole debate between agonistic, antagonistic, or cosmopolitan memory makes only sense in the framework of a social analysis where you actually look at people and ask how they feel about the past. And we have done so in our books on cosmopolitan memory. So I'm not sure I understand the claim of the authors that the cosmopolitanism does not take into account passion and sentiments. That's simply not true. Cosmopolitan memory is about passion and sentiments, and the way people's thinking and feeling about the past affects the way they wish to shape the future. This is, of course, an act of translation. An old point made by Walter Benjamin that translation is to grasp the plurality of languages, and they live in a constant state of flux. Therefore, translation is also the task of the language of cosmopolitanism. I think this is a rather important point, and we always pointed out in our work when we talked about cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan memory, that there's not one language of cosmopolitanism, but many languages, tongues, grammar. Cosmopolitanism is about a plurality of antagonisms and differences. And it's quite a while ago, I can say almost 20 years ago, that Daniel Levy and I introduced the concept of cosmopolitan memory into the debate on memory and transnationalism. Now, when we started out, we were not exactly sure what we meant by it. It was more of a hunch that something changed with memory in modern times. It was more a mode of thought and even action embodied in the memory of the future. It was a kind of prolepsis, something that we translated into sociology, namely that cosmopolitanism is understood as the memory of the future. Prolepsis is the anticipation of the future as already existing in the present. Cosmopolitan memory is an anxious ethic of anticipation. Specific iconicity of a specific historic event develops an allegorical aura that displaces its power of signification and symbolization from one historical event to another, from one singularity of suffering to another, from one historical context to another. Now, this is not the end of politics as claimed, but a new kind of politics. We also problematized reconciliation, showed how previous suffering does not make one more sensitive to the suffering of others. Whoever claimed that? Cosmopolitan memory can move from reconciliation to revenge and constantly translate anxiety. Cosmopolitan memory is, of course, not only based on dignity, like in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We never claimed that. But also on our alienation, moral ambivalences, and yes, personal agonisms. This is what cosmopolitan memory is all about. A past that refuses to die, confronted by a future that will not wait to be born. Transitional justice troubles us cosmopolitans because we know that transitional justice is not just. The most it is necessary. There are other theoretical frameworks, of course, and other theoretical formations working in similar paths. Besides being cosmopolitan memories, scholars have pointed out that memory is traveling, like Astrid has, is multidirectional, as Michael Rothberg has done. All of us speak of a deterritorialized memory that is increasingly shaped by individual, otherwise dispersed by culture, ethnic origin, religion, or class. Nevertheless, as important as well, this does not conflict with the fact that remembrance is always embedded in particular temporality and spatial context. While it is remembered across borders, the story and the message it entails can vary as much or even more as when it was confined to survivor communities in the post-war wars. Thus, we of course welcome the concept of agonistic memory to these theoretical frameworks. We cosmopolitans know that after every war in history follows eventually peace. Does that mean that achieving democracy is dependent on mass amnesia? Maybe not. Maybe it's too much to ask. People do remember, memory gets into the way of transitional justice, bodies rise from the earth, the death and the near-dead witnesses are talking. And although everyone wants the prosperity that comes from moving forward, this is never the only agenda. One could see this clearly in Spain, and Paco has done all the work to explain how and why this happened. Sometimes we have a quintessential Hobbesian situation where civil peace is often more important than morality, and where it is often the only precondition that can make real morality possible. Then there are other times when this is fundamentally the opposite, and which assumes that memory, that civil peace can never be endangered by activities of memory, and that no amount of mobilization, polarization, anathemization can ever bring about a complete breakdown of the state, but always purified. So the ultimate reality of the situation is sometimes the needs of peace, which means the realities of power. And then there are times when other arguments have been made, when you lead to compromise, less fearful lives. And there are times when this is just not enough anymore. And this is exactly what cosmopolitan sociology of memory is all about. At times agonistic, at times antagonistic, and at times, of course, searching for a synthesis. Whoever claimed that cosmopolitanism is about healing traumas? This is not true. Just the opposite is true. It's about analyzing the traumas. The idea of cosmopolitanism, and I come slowly to my conclusion, tries to preserve both the universal cosmos and the particular polis. Otherwise, why use the concept? Otherwise, why not say universalism? But it's not the same. It's about the interaction between global constellations and local circumstance. It is based, amongst others, on revulsions against the Holocaust and World War II, Stalinism, colonialism, and other forms of repression. So the trap that we may find ourselves is, of course, the need to understand that at times nationalists create absolutes out of relatives, while cosmopolitans ourselves seek to relativize all absolutes. Moreover, it seems at times that these tendencies are conflicting with each other, the true agony, if you like. However, the point of cosmopolitanism is to see that the universal and particular exist in a dialectical relation. They do not oppose each other. They define and influence each other. This is a crucial point in the cosmopolitan enterprise. In methodological cosmopolitanism, the universal means what it does because the particulars are its background, and where the particulars mean what they do because the universal is their background. As a result, when one changes, the other changes. But importantly, neither disappears. Universalism and particularism need to be thought out together. This means, for instance, that the strength of global culture does not entail the weaknesses of national culture. That is also clear for the EU. On the contrary, the strength of national culture is what produces cosmopolitan culture. The mutual influences of nations through the institutions of globalization produces both sides of cosmopolitanization, the central but growing core of common values and the globalized variations of local meaning. So we seek to give space to people's understanding of the past, as contradictory as they may be. Global constellations provide global patterns of how to structure the past in local settings. It would be a commonplace simplification to argue that people are prisoners of the past. I actually think that people everywhere engage creatively with the past. They develop a sense of the self and their immediate group create constitutions and develop actions informed by their views of the past. They relate to their own, their groups and their nations' past in different ways. I give an example how this can be understood in terms of cosmopolitan memory. Holocaust memory, for instance, and this is what we worked on in our early book, was created out of national memories in the same way that the EU was created out of nation states. In a similar manner, it has become independent of those national memories without shedding them completely, and it has begun to exert a shaping force upon them. It has the same relation to the EU as a national collective memories have to nation states. It may provide a collective identity, a we-they relation, which all members of the polity can participate to become part of the we. Thus, it could be almost a natural accompaniment of the constitution of a new collectivity. This was not originally so. It took decades for this phenomenon to develop into the present form. The Holocaust, for instance, became to be publicly remembered even in countries as removed from the crime scene as Argentina and Spain, decades after the reality itself has passed. It did not in any way spring naturally from those events. It originally emerged in many Western countries for very different reasons, in very different national contexts, and had very different meanings. In short, to argue that cosmopolitan memory depoliticizes is, in my humble opinion, just not true. The argument that the cosmopolitan mode of remembering builds on an understanding of the world as one big and potentially harmless entity is an untrue rumor about cosmopolitanism. The defense rests this case. Thank you very much. Okay, I move now from respondent to moderator of the sessions, and we have half an hour for discussion. Not even, I just hear 20 minutes? 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes. We have 15 minutes for discussion. Please come forward and introduce yourself. Yeah, with the mic, and introduce yourself. Who wants to go first? Maybe the agonist want to respond to the... Here, Stefan, no? Stefan, yeah.
Thank you very much, Natan. I think this was a very spirited defense and much appreciated, I think. Now, I thought it was talking rather well to what I was also trying to express in my introduction, namely that at least, you know, there were moments in the project, I think, where certainly I was thinking, well, I mean, in creating ideal types, we are, of course, I mean, that's the problem with Weberian ideal types, that they are always reductionist, and we are kind of reducing cosmopolitanism to some extent to a kind of straw man. And if we were to complexify our understandings of cosmopolitanism, you know, there would perhaps be possibilities talking about to what extent we can actually perhaps invest cosmopolitanism with a stronger agonism and reduce the parts of cosmopolitanism that I guess you would also be critical about, that are about, if you like, sort of one-sidedly empathizing with victims and producing or representing past conflicts in a way that is not helpful, I think, for understanding those conflicts. So I wonder I mean, your spirited defense was very much saying cosmopolitanism already has it all and we don't need agonism. But is there also a way of, in a way, combining the two forms of memory?
I don't think I should respond now because then the 15 minutes would be gone. So let's hear some more voices. Hans and then Wolf.
Yes, thank you, Nathan. I enjoyed very much listening to you, and as Stefan also said, what is missing in our original article is a more complex understanding of what cosmopolitanism is and all the different interpretations of that concept, and more nuanced way of understanding cosmopolitanism could also give another relation between agonism and cosmopolitanism. I absolutely agree on that. But still, I think that the ideal types that I showed, where we take our point of departure in a particular interpretation of cosmopolitanism coming from, for instance, Ulrich Beck, as I know, has also informed your studies. I think there are some issues still I would like to insist upon, and that's got to do with, among other things, the relation between the particular and the universal, as you are also mentioning. Because it is not the case, as you say, that agonists cannot stand cosmopolitan outlooks. I think cosmopolitanism for all of us corresponds very much to our social, political, ideological position in society. We feel attracted to cosmopolitan outlooks, all of us. Where I'm skeptical about cosmopolitanism is whether it is actually able to counter the antagonistic movements that are developing. If we look at the movement of the Yellow Vests in France, for instance, a movement with some kind of racist tendencies involved in it, but also a protest movement against the neopolitical, what's called neoliberal political and economical regimes of the European Union, right? What would it take to convince that movement to go to the left and not to the right? I think the universalists' argument that we are all humans and therefore it should not turn against the immigrants would be a loser's argument in that case. I think it would be the creation of another kind of we, a social, political we, turned against what you would call the elite. And that would be moves kind of left populist way forward for that movement. And that would be my most important argument for searching also in the memory regimes ways to, so to speak, counter the Holocaust discourse, memory discourse way of using the never again human rights based kind of discourse to frame the way we relate to contentious pasts. Because what we need, and that would be the agonistic position, is to repoliticize not only the conflicts of the past and see why did those conflicts actually emerge in the past, but also to find the parallels in the present and thereby repoliticize the relation of the present to the past. And I think that is the basic difference between those two positions as I see it. Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your, as you say, spirited defense. I just find myself a bit at a loss what to say, in the sense that your position came across as very uncompromising, and in a way I was also hoping for some reflection on the weaknesses of cosmopolitanism, at the very least in the way it has been applied and popularized, because it's all very well to say this is a travesty of cosmopolitanism, this is very much a parody of it, you know, this is a very simplistic version, but those are the versions that very often we find and that we found in museums and in other settings. So that is something that you have to recognize. When you said cosmopolitanism is actually very politicized, or can be, there is a paper tomorrow that will discuss cosmopolitanism in relation to Argentina, for example, which I know you've dealt with as well, but where the argument by Tony Robbins is that, in fact, it is so politicized, the cosmopolitan memory in Argentina, that it is very deeply antagonistic, in a way that it has hardened divisions even more so than at the time when the memory rift was explicitly antagonistic. So I was expecting more of a recognition of at least how cosmopolitans want to deal with this kind of situation, which represents a weakness of cosmopolitanism and a possibilities in various settings that cosmopolitanism is being hijacked, if you like, for very different projects which are dystopian and not utopian.
Okay, Wolf now?
Actually, that fits very nicely. I would also emphasize that we probably want to differentiate between cosmopolitanism as a complex theoretical intervention and the institutional political use of cosmopolitanism by institutions. That has been a very dynamic field, and I think in terms of our project, our unease is linked to the way that cosmopolitanism has been used as a very effective tool of power, as a tool of hegemonic power. I think if one looks at the way, for example, that Holocaust memory has evolved, then Holocaust memory in some places, you're absolutely right to emphasize how different it has evolved in different places, but in some locations it has been quite radically self-critical at times, and Germany is maybe the best example for that. In the meantime, it has become a place of memory comfort and a place of memory hegemony. And that, I think, so it's what Anna would call, so to speak, the abuses of cosmopolitanism, what I would call its institutionalization, its kind of political use. I think those are the questions that we are trying to unsettle in a kind of anti-hegemonic move. And you're right to point out that the theory has never been even close to as flat, the theory of cosmopolitan memory, as its gradual institution has become, which is also not surprising, the way that institutions work. And maybe one last point on that issue is maybe also because of a coincidence, the way that globalization has worked and the way that globalization has also shaped us as intellectuals. There is a certain unease, I think, about the seemingly blind eye that cosmopolitan memory has about the use of economic power. It seems to be on the level of institutionalization that cosmopolitan memory is, again, rather uncritical about the way that economic power and the way it coincides with the use of economic power. That does not apply to the theory, of course, as it was originally developed, which is much more complex.
Okay, let me try to respond as a concluding point for this session. I think we're constantly moving on two levels of analysis or universes of discourse, if I may sort of like stress again sociology of knowledge. There's a political argument, and Hans is very clear about the politics of it. And I can argue politics, and then we take our positions. I'm a cosmopolitan liberal, and I don't believe, if emphasis on belief, that you fight right-wing populism with left-wing populism. And that's my personal belief. Let's say that. And when I read Chantal Mouffe, she creeps me out. As simply as that. I mean, her use of Carl Schmitt, and when I see how Putin and his people sort of like quote her very softly, and I see the alliance between that kind of radical left-wing thinking with radical right-wing thinking, and I want to position myself politically as a liberal cosmopolitan against that. Against both tendencies. And if I see the yellow vests, I don't like their anti-Semitism, I don't like their racism, I don't like their sort of like populist rhetoric as much as I dislike Corbyn and his politics. But again, I mean, this is, you may think A, I may think B, and this is part of what political discourse is about. And I wonder if this is what UNREST is all about, that we're engaging in these kind of political discourse. Are we in favor of Corbyn? Do we like the yellow vest? Are we fighting right-wing populism with left-wing populism? I don't think it's all right when people like Chantal Mouffe use Carl Schmitt. I mean, it sounds fascist to me then. Has to sound. It has a smell on it, She can't get rid of that somehow fascist smell when she quotes in such a sympathetic way the work of Carl Schmitt. That's my political opinion. That's one thing. Then we have another thing, which is the memory scholarship. And in the memory scholarship, you have, of course, the application of certain memory fields into what you say, if it's being hijacked by museums or by EU projects, and how much we can take responsibility for that, and how much we should retake responsibility that. When it comes to memory scholarship, I use what I would call a cosmopolitan methodology. Using a cosmopolitan methodology means that I look at transnational processes on local grounds, how people translate anxieties. I think what bothers me sociologically, now not politically, what bothers me sociologically in the framework of agonist memory is that it is somehow, in my opinion again, stuck within the local frameworks. It wants to give credit to the local frameworks, fair enough. But I think as sociologists or as scholars, I mean, not everybody here is a sociologist, but as scholars of memory, we always have to think in terms of synthesis as well. Not only in terms of particularism and of giving credit to local anxieties, but also to see what the intellectual synthesis is all about. This is that's what I am concerned on an intellectual level. So I can see the political framework going in one direction. I can see the sociological or the scientific, let's not call it scientific, or the scholarship level maybe going in a different direction. Maybe they can be combined at some points, in the museums, in the theater, in all that. But what really bugs me are anti-cosmopolitan campaigns. Because anti-cosmopolitan campaigns remind me of bad things in history. And I don't think this is a coincidence. I really don't think, and I'm not accusing anybody who writes an agonistic memory of falling into these traps, but your intellectual teachers are. Chantal Mouffe is very conscious and very aware of the genealogical and historical origins she's coming from. And I would be very careful to fall into these, not to fall into these political intellectual traps. That's all I have to say. I mean, personally, I engage with fascists, I engage with anti-Semites, I listen to their arguments. They are interesting at times, they're not interesting at times, but this is the politics of everyday life. And scholarship, I think we have to go one step ahead and always go for the synthesis and not only for the particular. All right, it's 11:15 and we have to move on. I get your sign. I get your sign. We have to move. Thank you so much. It was fun.
Before Paco will continue, let me just take half a minute of your time for a very bureaucratic procedure, but very important. We will give around a list with your names insofar as you have registered. Please, if you could sign this list. This is for the EU, very important. Otherwise, we will get into difficulties. So don't be too agonistic about signing the list, please. But again, we will pass it around now. If your name is not on the list, at the very last page, there is space, so please add yourself on that list. Okay, thank you very much, and over to Paco for more interesting things.
Okay, so thank you to the people who have been really organizing this, all the work they have put into that, and also to Elisabeth for coming to discuss our paper. Now we are going down to earth. So basically, what we try to do with our research. I mean, as Hans has already spoken about the two empirical cases that were analyzed in UNREST. The choice was not innocent. I think it was very, very well designed. That's my opinion again. And basically, we wanted to do, on the one hand, analyze mass graves, and we understood mass graves as the ground zero of Europe's past violences. Basically, the difference would be like mass grave exhumations. You can't. Societies or social groups have to deal with raw violence. They have to do with the wounds. They have to do with the executed people and whatnot. So this is kind of raw memory. We can so we understood it as the ground zero of European violences. No? On the other hand, museums are like the black boxes, no? Encrypting all the tensions, memorial tensions that come up with a memorial discourse. So that was this kind of unmediated violence burning into the public space that we were trying to analyze. Obviously, the cases we chose, and we will be talking about them more in detail later, they are cases of civilians executed during different kinds of wars. That's very important, this issue of the civilians, because it's not like a frontline exhumation, but it's civilians executed in repressive actions, basically. No? So they are especially delicate, complex, and very controversial memory scapes. No? Other important thing in terms of mass grave exhumations is that they are becoming in the last few years a crucial tool in the international human rights discourses and practices. No? So when the transitional justice operation goes anywhere, they have to deal somehow with the mass graves. This could be done in many different ways, from doing nothing to exhuming them all. You have all the choices. So this is an important topic that is happening. I mean, exhumations are taking place around the world non-stop. There are like multinational kind of exhuming teams, like the Argentinian forensic team and others, that are working round the clock throughout the world. No? So just very briefly, I wanted to say that this is what we do. I mean, what we analyze in terms of memory studies. the importance of the forensic turn and forensic discourses and practice in the way in which memory, violent memory of the past is being framed. I don't have time to go into this because, well, any of these topics could go for ages now, and we've been working on this for many years. I just wanted to give you like a background of why we are doing this. No? So the technical protocols for deciphering the dead body in crime scenes occupy a central stage and may even displace other forms of approaching the legacies of violent past. No? So basically, what we have done like empirical research, basically historical and ethnographic research in 3 different countries. That's been Spain, Poland, and Bosnia. And basically what we have, we've been focusing on is, as you can see here what we have been analyzing is what kind of memory plots emerge around exhumations, which forms of commemoration, monumentalization, the emotive regimes also, the victimhood politics, you can see it here, the artistic elaborations, the media coverage, so everything that kind of comes out, all the afterlives, social and political and media afterlives of these exhumations. No? So it was very important also to do this comparative approach because, as you will see, we will kind of tiptoe over 3 very, very complex cases, but each of them is different, and the kind of memory modes that emerge around them first are different. There are different vernacularization of globalized memory discourses, but at the same time they work, and they are in different kinds of tensions, and that's what I think is important in terms of dealing with UNREST memory framework. No? So yeah, so how can mass grave exhumations contribute to the theoretical debate that was just started in the former session? We cannot go into the abstraction of the former debate, which kind of, as I said, will go back to down to earth. No? So we understand exhumations as potentially agonistic fora, but not only potentially, because we'll see that the thing is more complex on the ground. That obviously these exhumations raise high stakes for societies and for collectives of victims, and they attract a wide array of different stakeholders, emotions, and also possibilities of counter-hegemonic memorial discourses. No? I think this is a very important point. So we thought that we would adopt a dynamic approach, combining, as I said, ethnographic research, also and the historical evolution of memorial modes in each case study. We thought it was very important to see, because the timing of the memory modes we are talking about in UNREST is important. For example, the transition to democracy in Spain, we have no concept for it because it's kind of pre-cosmopolitan, because cosmopolitanism was not available, in the global discourse when this happened. So I think it's important to track the evolution of memory discourses because this is a very complex, dynamic process. No? So what we wanted to do is to test the specific deployment in each of the cases of the memorial modes under study here, their limits and the transactions, and already Hans talked about the relational nature of agonism. And on the ground, the memory modes do not appear in ideal type formats. I mean, also Stefan mentioned this, that this is absolutely impossible. And what we found is that they evolve, they modulate, they coexist, they contaminate, and even fall into one another. And I think that the former discussion kind of points to these situations in which it's not easy at all to understand which one is working. And as Anna was also mentioning in the paper of Tony Robben, how cosmopolitanism can become an alibi for antagonism, a disguise for antagonism, and we find this also in our cases. No? So the memorial work around exhumations varies and depends on the nature of the killings in each case, the time frame, or whether the socio-political, the judicial, and the structural conditions are completely different in each of in the 3 countries. And we have, Wolf was also mentioning the institutionalization. This is extremely important, and it conditions, obviously, the way in which this is going to unfold. For example, we have in the Balkans, we have International Judicial Umbrella, which is the International Court for the former Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, an administrative contrasting system in Spain, and institutionalized memory politics in Poland. And just very briefly, because these are like the three cases we studied, we kind of conceptualize this in three different ways. For example, in Spain, we call it like intertwined memory model. So they come all together and they are feeding into one another. No? In Poland, in the Polish case, we kind of characterize it as memory modes in disguise. So some memory modes would come in disguise of other memory modes. And in Bosnia, the Bosnian case, which is the most recent one, and also the time frame between the violence, and Hans was making reference to this, to where agonism should come in and whatnot. Bosnia, we talk about parallel memory modes. So we'll try to flesh this out now in a few minutes because we don't have much time. So let's move to the Spanish case. I just wanted to show you this image because this is kind of the shocking image of Spain, but you could actually expand this image to the whole of Europe because this is but this was Spain's discovery that our cherished democracy was kind of this cartoon was really expressive. No? It was built on a bunch of executed bodies, not from the civil war. So that was kind of shocking. So basically, what we did in Spain was to choose three different exhumations in different time frames. One is from the first one you see there, Casa de Don Pedro, is from the transition to democracy. Then Villamayor de los Montes, I did ethnographic fieldwork there in 2004. It's an early exhumation where cosmopolitanism was still not available in Spanish case. It came later. And then you have the Guadalajara one, which is basically a transition. I mean, it's like a 100% cosmopolitan. That's, so we chose these three cases to analyze the evolution. And in each of the cases, in Spain and Poland and Bosnia, we've done the same. So basically, which are like the main themes, very briefly, of what we have found in Spain. No? So well, the first point is, I won't go into it very much, but what's important to understand is that these exhumations that are taking place in Spain now are not the first exhumations of the Civil War, are the last ones. There have been three former stages of exhumation, and this is very important to understand it. I don't have time to go into it, but there were many post-war exhumations done by Francoists on his own people. Then, you probably know the Valley of the Fallen, this incredible monument we have in Spain. Very difficult to deal with, and there was a movement. More than 30,000 bodies were moved there in the 50s and 60s. Then during the transition to democracy, there was another necropolitical stage, so to speak, and now we have the contemporary one. Each of them have different characteristics, different types of victims, different stakeholders, different memorial modes around them. So the thing is that we are dealing with the last ones, but we have to understand that this is like there is a genealogy of digging up bodies of the Civil War and whatnot. So in the transition to democracy, remember the first slide that we had before? No? It was done under what we have called a pre-cosmopolitan, at the same time non-agonistic, because we were at a loss of concepts for this. No? Reconciliatory national paradigm. Hans has referred to it. So it's extremely, it's very important. No? In the memorial processes in the early 21st century have a different feature, which is that they started to be done through forensic protocols and technologies. No? And so at first they combine this reconciliatory kind of transition mode with antagonistic, anti-fascist, and an embryonic cosmopolitan mode. This would be like the first configurations during the first years of the exhumations. This was kind of a mix-up. No, it was like a blender of different memory modes. No, and it also depends on the regions and the agendas. It's not the same in the Basque Country or in Andalusia. A lot of nuances here. No, so we have one very important point which has to do with the downloading of the cosmopolitan global discourse into Spain through Baltasar Garzón after 2008. And this was basically, Baltasar Garzón tried to indict Francoism in the year 2008, downloading international law, and particularly the figure of forced disappearances. No? So judicially it was a total failure, but in terms of the impact in the memory politics in Spain and in the memory modes, it was tremendous, because it was basically the downloading or this global cosmopolitanism Natan vernacularized in the Spanish way, which is a very peculiar vernacularization. No? And this is the point where Spanish memory associations understood that the cosmopolitan discourse worked to their advantage, because they connected, or at least the way in which it was legally downloaded by Baltasar Garzón, it connected Spain with crimes against humanity, and this gave them like a new kind of strength to develop their claims. No? So. But one thing that's important here, and we have talked about this, the politicization or depoliticization of cosmopolitanism, there is no apolitical cosmopolitanism in Spain at all. It actually produces committed political subjects, and does not necessarily privatize memory, I mean, in the terms in which it was established in the original theoretical paper. No? So this is I think, some of the important topics, and as I said, we are just tiptoeing over this kind of stuff. No? So yes, we find that within this broadly cosmopolitan version, or Spanish version of global cosmopolitanism in Spain, we find these agonistic traits. And I think that what the former discussion really builds into this. I mean, this is clearly connected, and we have called it agonistic commando operations, which is kind of I don't know. It's just we came out with this idea because, but also it's kind of it's like when in our discussions in UNREST we talked about the agonistic moments, and also with Wolf in your exhibition. No? How but the framework is basically cosmopolitan. But also we find that that there is like a very self-reflexive impugnation of the hegemonic historical narrative of the transition. Hans also referred to this. So this can be like read as agonistic in a sense, or soft agonism, or something in between cosmopolitanism and agonism, which is what we are finding everywhere. Then they also expose memorial contradictions and institutional memory politics through these command operations. I don't have time to. It's more of a tactics in Gramscian terms, no. But it's we don't have time to go into this. I mean, to have the examples, no. Another important thing is that there is a direct influence of Mouffe and Laclau in emergent, for good and bad, I don't know. But there is a political party in Spain called Podemos, and they directly, they write, one of their leaders write books with Chantal Mouffe. So that means that we could understand Spain also as an agonistic laboratory in this sense, and kind of trace the limits of agonism, no? So this is the entanglement of different memorial modes at different levels, and the revolution in times raises questions for UNREST theoretical premises. No? So basically what we need to inject is dynamics in terms of temporality and scale to better understand rapidly shifting situations on the ground. So basically, just to sum up, no? When you have this beautifully drafted theoretical ideal type kind of framework, when you bring it down to the ground and you see the complexity of processes, it's kind of difficult. Sometimes it constrains a little bit the analysis. And what we have found is that actually agonism works within cosmopolitanism. That's basically. Marije, now you have to. She's a bit sick, so.
You don't want to show your pictures?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot.
Yeah.
This is just a couple of pictures we have. Chris Reynolds is going to be talking about storytelling. I just wanted to make this connection to the storytelling that takes place around exhumations. It's very, very interesting, and sometimes you find adversaries. They're talking over the bones, and well, this kind of agonistic interventions, like displaying the statue, the beheaded statue of Franco in one of very powerful memory site in Catalonia, or just this last image about, I don't need to comment on this. It's an artistic.
Yeah? Okay, please bear with me. I hope my voice will I won't end up coughing throughout the whole presentation. So I will say something about Poland's memory modes in disguise. And since Paco started with an image, I also wanted to start with an image. And what I chose is this image of objects which are retrieved from the different exhumations that I studied historically and ethnographically. And this reminds me of when I started going to Poland and telling them, well, I'm interested in exhumations and I want to study this and that. All the Polish people were like, oh, this is such a Polish topic, how can you even be interested in this? This is something nationalistic and so on. But actually, when you look at these are all memorialized, these are objects from museums and from different mass graves. But so what we are interested in, and what also came out of my research, is that these graves and these objects, they are framed in different memory modes over time. So it's not just that these exhumations are only framed or voiced in one of the memory modes that we study, but they change over time. And in the end, I will try to say something about what kind of polemics we got about these objects. So the three cases that we studied in Poland, they're a bit different than the Spanish cases because on the one hand, they are, for especially Katin and Jedwabne, they are very famous cases. They have been very much memorialized. There has been done a lot of studies about it, and what is also interesting about these two cases is that the main interest in these exhumations was to find out who the real perpetrators were. So it was not really an exhumation to retrieve the bodies of victims and to return them to their relatives, but rather to find truth. So exhumations in Poland, they are very, very much related to truth finding, and particularly related to the perpetrators. And then Powązki Military Cemetery, that's where I did my ethnographic fieldwork. That's where they are exhuming the bodies of the cursed soldiers, which is like the new myth of the far right-wing Polish government of law and justice. So that is, a whole new, very antagonistic discourse. The general observations, like comparing and thinking about these three cases, is one important thing I think we have to think about is the temporal development of memory politics. That in Spain, when we look in Poland, when we look at the moment of transition to democracy in 1989 to now, we see a transition from cosmopolitanism towards antagonism. So maybe that also phrases a bit the fears of Anna and Hans when they write their article, right? That cosmopolitanism can easily move into that antagonism. What is, I think, interesting to think about these cases, and I will say, and particularly when we think about Jedwabne, is this focus on the perpetrators. And in Jedwabne, I think that this debate that was created in Polish society about the local perpetrators, and that was about the creation of evil within Polish society, we can see it as a kind of agonistic correction to a main cosmopolitan memory paradigm that was there in Poland during the 90s. So the moment when Poland was running up to getting into the European Union, we can say that they very much matched with the hegemonic cosmopolitan memory frameworks of the European Union, and that Jedwabne debate that fell right into that cosmopolitan framework. And Jedwabne exhumations, they were also carried out by the just then constituted Institute of National Remembrance. So it was a state enterprise, but researching into local perpetrators. And then in the end, Powązki is a very populist, nationalist site, but because it falls into this transnational framework of forensics related to human rights, related to victims, and that's why we tell that there we see memory modes in disguise. What we see here is that this antagonistic framework actually dresses itself with all kinds of features of what we would say that are features of cosmopolitan memory. So we can say it is antagonism in disguise. So it is actually a nationalist rhetoric of us and them. The victims are not returned to the families, but the victims are returned to the nation, let's say. But it goes together with rhetorics of human rights. And then a little bit more about my work at Powązki Military Cemetery, because I think it's a really interesting memory space in itself. So, and that's also how we can think more about how an exhumation site can work as a potential agonistic space. So what we see at Powązki is that it has this inherent multi-perspectivity because it contains graves of all the important Polish people who did something for the Polish nation, but that means that they're anti-communist fighters, anti-Nazi heroes, but also Polish communist leaders such as Bierut or Gomułka. So you have all these people creating a kind of community of death at that cemetery. We have this antagonism in disguise. We have all kinds of, or a very important focus on DNA identification at these exhumations at Powązki of these cursed soldiers. And that seems like a similar vocabulary as what we see, for instance, in Spain. However, this is a focus on DNA analysis without a centrality of the relatives' voices. So there are hardly any relatives of these cursed soldiers. Sometimes they even exhume the parents to get DNA material to be able to exhume the other bodies that they find. So this is really, we want to identify our heroes and we want to give them a state burial and we want to memorialize them as heroes of the nation. But then, for instance, there we have also somebody buried and still not identified, who is Witold Pilecki, who is this kind of, on the one hand, for the Polish national, for the Law and Justice Party, he is this national victim hero, but for his family, he is a cosmopolitan hero. So the family of Pilecki, they really try to withhold the current Polish state from absorbing his memory and making him into one of these national heroes like the other cursed soldiers. And they use really much this cosmopolitan voice to do that. What is also important in this case is that, well, and that's really antagonistic, is that the way they try to create a unique voice is the judicialization of history and the criminalization of diverging voices, as what we have seen in the newspapers the last year. So many things about history, they can't be said anymore, so that is really antagonistic. And what is also really interesting is how these passions of belonging, these nationalist passions of belonging, they work together with a discourse of compassion with victims, which we would relate rather to a cosmopolitan framework. And then, yeah, a few pictures from what it was like at the exhumation site. So this is a priest from the Łomża region who came as a volunteer to work at the exhumations, and so there's a lot of sacralization and devotion going on in this space as a space of memory of the Polish anti-communist nation. And this is also, for me, a telling picture because it says something. It has this kind of devolution of the bodies, but at the same time we see all the people wearing nationalistic t-shirts. We have this smoke going on that we see also a lot in these nationalistic marches that we have in Poland. So it is also a mixture between the forensic language and the nationalist language that's going on in Poland. Paco, I think you're going to say a little bit about Bosnia. And then I will say a few conclusions.
Okay, so as Marije put image after to present Poland, I put another one for Bosnia. And this basically is based on the work of Admir Djugo, who kind of did all the, Elisabeth knows him very well, and he's the one who provided us with all the data on the Bosnian case. I will go very fast because we don't have much time so basically Admir followed these 3 exhumations. The Budak, which is connected to the Srebrenica killings, is a secondary mass grave. It's not, as you know, the Serbian perpetrators just removed the mass graves to destroy evidence. So this is a secondary, and that's a Serbian church that was built on top of the mass grave site, and the controversies that happening there. In the garbage dump in Sarajevo, this is they were looking for Serbian civilians executed during the siege of Sarajevo, and then you have the Prijedor case, which is a much more complex. But these were the 3 case studies that we followed in Bosnia to try to make sense of how the different memory modes, the theoretical memory modes, kind of parachute into the ground here. So basically, and this is the reason we talk about parallel memory tracks here, we have that on the ground, the agonistic mode clearly predominates along ethnic lines, and is related to the entrenched divisions of the post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina, consolidated by the Dayton Accords. I mean, this is what Admir transmitted to us. Basically, we were doing workshops with local stakeholders, and when we would ask him, can you do us, can you have diverse stakeholders, like a multi-ethnic kind of workshop? And he said, with or without Kalashnikovs. No? So basically, what he was trying to tell us is that antagonism is what really, on the ground, these ethnic lines are very, very antagonistic. No? But also, the post-conflict exhumations and memory politics at the same time are heavily influenced by the huge transnational operative led by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and all the processes it set in motion, which are like immense and massive, and this obviously has to impact in some way, the memory politics on the ground and the post-war, I mean the conflict transformation, as the peace and conflict people would say, in Bosnia. So it was basically a complex parachuting of a mostly cosmopolitan approach. Again, in different situations in Spain, different vernacularization, different levels. No? So basically, what's interesting about this is like, for example, what happens when people talk, in family settings, they can adopt, an antagonistic memory mode. But if they have to give testimony in a judicial court, it basically becomes like a cosmopolitan narrative, because it's done within a cosmopolitan context. No? So the arrival of post-conflict trauma, the persecution of perpetrators, the pro-human rights funding, the new profiles of victimhood were supported by extensive funding, by hegemonic memorial plots, by bureaucracies, institutions, diverse experts and technologies that parachuted into Bosnia and obviously transformed situation on the ground. In the conversations with Admir, we had a lot of Skyping over this. He said, well, this has promoted some kind of cosmopolitanism, and sometimes it has been strategic because some local stakeholders could become cosmopolitan if fundings were available, and then we'll move into something else later. No? This also has to do with transitional justice and whatnot. But he also said that this cosmopolitan peace process and its transitional structures is mostly translated into antagonistic memory politics on the ground. So this is the reason in which there is interaction. There is obviously a massive cosmopolitan operation, but the antagonism on the ground holds its ground and translates this cosmopolitanism for their own means. For example, exhumations are understood in different ways by the different ethnic communities. The Serbians go back to the Second World War and to Jasenovac, no? To build their victimhood politics, no? Because it's also a body count, so to speak. No? So this whole process, cosmopolitan process, doesn't really influence heavily the basic antagonism. And so we have, this is an example of a coexistence. No? Both modes are operating at different levels. They may interact, but it's not the case of in Spain where they are mixed up and they can evolve and transform into one another. No? So basically, we have we found also that there are some occasional agonistic interventions, but they were minor and they were. Well, one of them is interesting, but this one, for example, Admir sent us this picture of Emir Hotchkiss. There was a in Prigidor, there was this performance. There were a number of associations with including members of different ethnic groups, and they wanted to homage the women that were killed by the Serbians there. The ceremony was called off, but this man did it on his own because he thought it should be done. So is this an agonistic command operation? I don't know. But we kind of were trying to look for these kind of situations to happen there. No? And I think this is more important, no? The role, I mean, what over the last 25 years plus, the women in black, the Serbian women in black have been doing in terms of unsettling, the antagonistic dominant mode on the ground. And this is one performance in 2015, and it's connected to the Srebrenica kind of commemoration, no? And basically, this is like Serbian women kind of empathizing with the crimes with the victims of the Serbians, and so this is, I think, an interesting space that couldn't be understood in cosmopolitan, in agonistic terms. And now, Marije, just to.
Conclusions. So, trying to work with the theoretical model of unrest on the ground for us was quite challenging. As you can see, many things happen around the exhumations. So that's why in the end we really, one of our conclusions is that we need to think more of a dynamic approach towards these memory modes. Maybe, in a pre-designed museum or something like a novel or a movie which has like a pre-created idea, something can be one mode, but on the ground in such a space as an exhumation, many things happen at the same time. So, and people can take different positions at the same time. So different memory agents may develop various memory strategies and plots. Cosmopolitan and agonistic memory regimes, they do not appear in pure formats, and we have this seepage of the global human rights paradigm in local antagonistic modes. So we see that in the end, I think to a certain extent in the three cases, where in the end this forensic practice is downloaded or taken from that human rights paradigm. We also think that it's important to evaluate the implicit evolutionism and the historical genealogies of the three memory modes. That is related, for instance, to what do we do with the Spanish transition to democracy? Well, it is like a pre-cosmopolitan moment, but also when does agonism rise? Does it already exist, or is it just a potential horizon for the future? So these are like some of the general conclusions. And then about why we propose to see exhumations as fora for debate. Eyal Weizmann, he writes about forensics as the art of the forum, the practice or skill to present an argument before a professional, political, or legal gathering. So if we think of an exhumation as a forum for debate, as a place where different truths and different voices are together in one space, which on the one hand it is being done to contextualize a historical event through evidence. This is one of the important things why exhumations are carried out, and it attracts opposite voices which to a certain extent sometimes opens up this radical form of multi-perspectivity, especially when, for instance, in Poland, there was a case that they had to remove graves to be able to get to the graves of these cursed soldiers, and the graves they had to remove were actually of Polish militaries from the 1980s, so they had to start talking to the families of these people, which are bad communists, to say it in like simple way. But I mean, then you find that the exhumation makes that actually radical opposite voices have to start talking to each other to come to an agreement and do something. Examples of these exhumations as a fora for debate are the Spanish exhumations, which repoliticize the past, and they break the consensus of the consensus about the peaceful transition. But also, for instance, at Wapne, that brought about an important emotional debate on Polish perpetratorship. But on the other hand, exhumations do not necessarily need to be cosmopolitan or agonistic. They can be very antagonistic, like the cursed soldiers exhumations, or they can be kind of depoliticized, as what we see in Bosnia. So that's why we say they are potential agonistic fora. It doesn't need to be so. In the end, all three modes, they mix up together. And yeah, these are our conclusions. And I forgot when I was sitting there, my head, I'm sorry, I'm a bit not so concentrated, but I told you I would say something more about these keys, and I don't want to leave you with a promise that I don't fulfill. So what is interesting here on the right side, these are objects from the cursed soldiers, which I retrieved from Powązki. Down, these are objects from Katyn at the Katyn Museum, and up, these are keys from the Jedwabne exhumation, which were exhibited at the Gdansk Museum of the Second World War. So they are just objects, but they tell all kinds of different stories, and they're also framed. So especially these keys of Jedwabne, they became a big problem with the change of government in Poland, and they had to be taken out of the permanent exhibition because there should not be anything about Jedwabne there. So there you can see how certain moments it is possible to talk about these kind of things, and then with a political change you can move into a whole different mode and everything is off the agenda. So that's what we came to tell. Okay. Should I take this away?
Oh, you can leave the key.
Okay.
Yeah. My talk will be, and my intervention will be less brilliant, far less brilliant than Natan Sznaider one, and much more shorter. Actually, the first thing I wanted to say very seriously is that I'm thanking the British School at Rome for its welcoming, but I want to express my solidarity and support for British academia. We are 7 weeks away from a major collapse in the history of European academia. And we have to fight against these centrifugal forces as much as we can. So I suggest adopt a British academic plan, and every one of us has to think very seriously about taking on board a British academic in every project that will raise in the weeks, months and years to come. We have to stay close to them, we have to support them, they will need us. And yeah. Well, I hope, for example, it's not a joke. I hope this place will still exist next year. We are speaking about that. And I would like to be invited again, seriously. So let's adopt a British academic. Then I want to thank Stefan and all the team for these fantastic 3 years. I've been UNREST a very side member, but it has been very interesting to see you working together, meeting, discussing, because all this is about disagreement and discussion. And this project has proved to be very successful because we disagree, I think, but we have been able to discuss, and that's the most important thing. Still, many challenges remain, and one of them is precisely, and I disagree with you, Stefan, the engagement with the negationism and the far right. We have to find a way to cope with that, and we can't say, well, we are not taking them, we are not discussing them, because we are leaving them to occupy a specific place then, and we have to find a way to engage and to discuss with this part of the world. And this brings me to the first of my 3 points, which are comments but also questions that I'm raising to both of you. My first point is about lie. My second is about language, and the third and last is about sustainability. As about lie, actually, going back to your fantastic paper, you are mentioning, because there are many lies that we have to deal with in if speaking about social cohesion and spaces of remembering. There are many lies, and I'm more specifically thinking about lying through omission. You are speaking about the pact of oblivion in the Spanish case, you are speaking about amnesia in the Polish case, you are speaking about denial in the Bosnian case, and I was wondering if one of the challenges that remains is to deal with lie, and to take lie very seriously as a topic. And what do we do when we have to deal with this lie through omission, or these very fake facts or fictions? And that could be an interesting topic to go further. Take them just as an object seriously and try to understand how they work, how they became successful, how they disseminate, how they live, and how they die, hopefully. My second point, and I'm jumping on also on one point that was made by Natan, is about language. We know, because we anthropologists have read Sapir and Whorf, then each way of phrasing is also a way of understanding the word. That means that every language refers to a group with his history, social differentiation, cultural patterns, and so on. So couldn't we pay shouldn't we pay a specific attention to the type of languages that are used? Because you have underlined in your paper the language of rights, which I think is predominant in all that is said about exhumations and truth and reconciliation and blah, blah, blah. But we also have the language of emotions, which uses a completely different lexicon and generated a different type of narrative. And then we recently, especially in the Bosnian case, have the language of medicine that is also very technical. and that is phrasing the things, the social cohesion in a very different way. You have to be genetically related to be legitimate to speak. So that's also interesting to study. And my last point is about sustainability and sustainability of our achievements, sustainability of our academic work, and I'm very glad that you ended up with these keys that ended up by being taken off. What happened when things go back to antagonism? We shouldn't take things for granted and saying, oh yes, we did it. No, we didn't anything. Everything is very unstable, everything is very fragile. British can go out of Europe in 7 weeks. Woohoo! So what kind of Europe are we speaking about? And I agree with one of your conclusions about the prevent the lecture of our work from being evolutionist and prevent any sense of happy ending. I think that could be interesting to work precisely on the cases when antagonism happens again or reappears, and try to understand how, why, and what exactly is happening then. It won't be a very pleasant project, but that might be very interesting. Maybe a bit depressive, but interesting, because I think that one of our achievements is also to reflect about the way of having all this being sustainable. So I'm leaving you to answer my 3 questions.
So, look, I'm very aware of time rushing by, so if I could just ask Marije and Paco to respond to if that's all right, Elisabeth. Yeah, and then we can have a coffee break, and I will come back with more news on the programme.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe it's easier, or, yeah.
Okay, yes, okay.
Maybe Paco, you can come. So I think I will say something about my Polish fieldwork, because I think it's very much related to the issue you've raised of what happens when antagonism all of a sudden takes over. I think that's a very big problem in Poland at this moment. And in that sense, yeah, the fieldwork there for me was in a way very difficult, because you don't have a political same ground. You feel like an intruder in a right-wing movement. But on the other hand, I think it was also an interesting experience, and at a certain point I was thinking of myself as a kind of agonistic person in that right-wing antagonistic movement. So there was the Dutch girl working in Spain with a Bulgarian surname, asking about this Polish exhumation. So I was the super cosmopolitan. They also asked me a lot of questions about that to see who I really was. But I think, in a way, it is really important to get to know these people. And I thought that for me that was a big lesson, to get to know this antagonistic movement, and that in the end it was much less violent than I thought, and maybe, I don't know, I think for them it was also interesting that I was actually interested in their patriotic work. So for me, just an approach to the other, that would be for me like a way to move in that field. And then about lies, yeah, that is a big deal in Poland when we talk about exhumations, because Katyn was about lies. I mean, the whole history about Katyn was about lies, and the memorialization of Katyn was about countering the lie of Stalinism. So this is exhumations are maybe framed as a way of finding truth, in a way bones don't lie, that kind of idea. But of course that's not like that. It's just a basis for any kind of discourse, and that's what's now happening in Poland, in a way that they're searching for heroes who are actually also war perpetrators, but they try to kind of put that away and portray like one family of hero soldiers. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know really how, yeah, it would be interesting to follow that as kind of myth making. I think it's very related to that, like how myths work and how they rise and maybe how they die. But yeah, maybe I don't have a very clear answer.
Thanks, Marije. You can sit. She's feeling miserable. So let me just briefly tell you a little anecdote. Like a year and a half ago, we acted as extras in a movie called Petra. That it's a good movie, but it didn't make to the Spanish prizes. But it was a photographer, the story of a photographer and his love affair, and he's a social photographer, so he kind of does photographs at exhumations. So we acted as extras in one of these exhumations, part of our team with the forensic doctor and whatnot, and we went there, and they had like this wonderful mass grave like, with plastic skeletons. No? So the forensic doctor, who is kind of, kind of funny, he said, nothing to say, the setup is wonderful, this is just a few shots, no? But let me tell you, this body has 3 legs, and this one, the head is turned around, if you don't mind, let me fix this. So, this is to say that in Spain, this negationism is there, so people is saying that these mass graves are actually planted, this plastic bones. I think we have to take this very, very seriously. This is, on the one hand, to answer, to talk about lies, and fake news. Now it could lead us, nowhere, because it's a huge topic. No, so one thing that for me is interesting is in the sense how we've been talking about the downloading of global processes, but we also have to think in parallel of the uploading of things that are happening on the ground. And in the case of Spain, we are starting to lose track of what's true and what's not true without much fake news. It's just the way in which the social media work. For example, in Spain, you can take pictures in the exhumations because there is no legal parachute. I mean, there is no legal umbrella in the exhumation. So anybody can go there and take pictures and in real time upload them in Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, whatever you have it. No? So the thing is that these bodies become instantly decontextualized and they become part of a global pool of executed bodies and sometimes even executions that took place in Bosnia are understood by people as having taken place in Spain because they circulate in this global system and it's very difficult to track the genealogy of a particular image. So not to talk about the bodies, I mean the bodies can be anywhere in the world so it's very interesting to see how the excess in terms of production, digital production of memory can. I mean, you don't have to lie or just to do purposely fake news to produce them, so to speak. So, but this is like a broader debate we could talk about. But what I wanted to I mean, other of the questions you talk about is the types of language and the new memory languages, and I think this is very, very important, particularly when transitional justice has become into a full-blown, transnational operation, pretty neoliberal in my sense, but we can discuss also about this, in which you have the language of rights, which is the judicial kind of plot, memorial plot, is very powerful and is adopted, it's patched down and adopted by but also the medicalization you talked about, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, it's like the rule of the game. So you have these people, these transnational groups parachuting into different situations and translating social suffering into this kind of medical concepts, and this becomes part of the memory process, obviously, because you, as I mentioned briefly before, when you give your testimony to a psychologist, it's not the same as, the context is kind of cosmopolitanizes, in a sense, the discourse, but also medicalizes it. But also, in this sense, I think I mentioned the importance of the forensics now in terms of dealing with violent memory as a emerging dominant memory plot. So this I just wrote a paper also under the umbrella of different from the one that you read, on the umbrella of UNREST, where I talk about phantom militarism. And what I mean by this is that once the forensic discourse takes central stage, basically the memories are going to be, so to speak, polluted by the militarism that produced the killings, because we are talking about criminal scenes, and then the language of forensics is the criminal in these cases, crime against humanity type criminal scene, and so everything is translated into calibers, wounds, tortures, and effects on the bodies of the violences and whatnot, and this is absorbed by the memorialist movement, and this is what I call phantom militarism, because in a sense the memorial process kind of reflects, it's a mirror image of the violence that produced it. So for me this is kind of problematic, but this is just to say that obviously these processes are extremely complex and we have to deal with them at very different levels, as you were kind of suggesting. So we could go for ages, but I think that the coffee is waiting for us, and so Nina, it's okay if we continue later in the hall? Or? Okay.
So we're going to have the next session on war museums, and then we'll have lunch as planned at 1 o'clock. And so everything this afternoon will be pushed back by 1 hour, and we won't have the policy recommendation session at the very end. Instead, tomorrow in the Q&A period, I will present some of our policy recommendation ideas, and we can maybe have a discussion about that at that point. Okay? So all you need to know is that lunch is at 1, and everything this afternoon is pushed back by an hour. Okay?
Hello. So we will share our presentation with Eleanor Rowley, and I will first make a short introduction and speak about our case studies and methodology, and then I will pass over to Eleanor to speak about the kind of make a very brief summary of our main findings in work package 4. So. As was already said, work package 4 of UNREST was analyzing memorial regimes of museums related to the history of World War I and World War II. And sort of the basis of our thinking was an article published by Anna Centerbull and Hansen Lauge 2016, so when the project started, entitled Agonistic Memory, and this article in a way provided a theoretical framework for our work. And as already mentioned, we distinguished 3 memorial regimes, the antagonistic one, the cosmopolitan one, and the agonistic one. And kind of our objective in this work package was to test the extent to which the sort of the shift towards cosmopolitan memory, which in a way was announced by Natan Sznaider and Daniel Levy in their book in the beginning of the 20th century, in how far this can be also applied to museums, and also to assess a possible inclusion of what we called agonistic representations and practices in these museum exhibitions. Thus, we have selected 5 institutions for our analyses. Yes, those were all museums dealing with both World War I and World War II, or either or. All the museums were established or refurbished after 1990. And they were also researched for museums which would be really in various parts of Europe. Here on the slide you will find some more information on the analyzed museums. Here I will only say it was the Kobarid Museum in Slovenia, which is a World War I museum, basically the historial of the Great War in Peron, the Oskar Schindler's Factory in Krakow in Poland, which is mainly dealing with the sort of history of the occupation, German occupation of Krakow. 39-45, the German-Russian Museum Berlin Karlshorst, and the Military History Museum in Dresden. So those were our main case studies, but also to ensure a coherence and balance of our comparative study, we organized study trips to all those places together. So there were always scholars responsible for each of the case studies, but we seen all those places together to kind of know what we are talking about. And also we visited together the Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres, and then we had some other, to sort of enrich our comparative basis, we also had made individual visits to some other places, and some of them are mentioned here in, on the, here down. So the idea was to, in our work, to kind of to take into account 3 levels of analysis. First, the producers, so in this case the museum stakeholders, the exhibition makers, the products themselves, thus the exhibitions, and also the recipients, thus the visitors. First, we made a detailed analysis of the permanent exhibitions, and we tried to take into account both this sort of visual level and also the textual level of the displays. Secondly, we examined the history and origins of each of the museums through archival research, and in addition we conducted interviews with different stakeholders, founders, directors, curators, scientific advisors to the museums, and other agents involved in the museum making process. And we tried to reconstruct, as far as possible, of course, the circumstances of the establishment of the analyzed museums and the setup of the new exhibitions, and also trace the controversies which surrounded this exhibition-making process. And finally, what we did was that we also examined public responses to the exhibitions, first through press research. We studied the public debates accompanying the opening of the exhibitions, but additionally we also made at each site 30 up to 50 interviews, semi-structured interviews with the visitors, and analyzed entries in visitors' books. And in 2 museums we also piloted an image-based tablet questionnaire. And now to say, it must be said that during our research we encountered several obstacles. The first was that, in fact, as I think in the other case study we heard about, we found it finally quite difficult to sort of operationalize the UNREST theoretical framework for the need of the particular exhibition analysis. So finally, we have defined or distinguished a number of traits applying to historical exhibition, which we defined as characteristic for the free memory regimes. And here, just so that you can take a brief look at. But again, we must stress that we treat these as ideal types in the Weberian sense. So we don't claim that there is any kind of pure agonistic, antagonistic, cosmopolitan exhibition. One exhibition can include elements of those different kind of ways of talking about history, although there might be exhibition which sort of lean toward one or other way of telling history. Still, while in some papers which were produced within kind of our project, we refer directly to this overall theory, in others we sort of try to break this theory into little bits which are somewhat easier to handle and touch only on some aspects of this theory, like about multilingualism in historical exhibition, multi-perspectivity, which is also only one aspect of what we defined as agonism, or as about museums as a tool of reconciliation and cultural diplomacy. Secondly, we also realized, and this is another obstacle, that we have to be very careful about generalizing from those 5 case studies, which is a very kind of small, we maybe went in depth, but it's a very small sample in a way. And so the research needs to be confirmed or rejected by further research. And now Eleanor will present this sort of brief summary of our key findings, and I just wanted to stress that this presentation is based on an article or a report from our work package, which was published just last month in Museum Worlds.
Thank you, Zofia. So our analysis of the 5 case study museums largely seemed to confirm our initial hypothesis that the memory of war in contemporary Europe has indeed shifted from antagonism to cosmopolitanism. The Historial in Perron, the Historial in Perron at the Somme in France is exemplary of this cosmopolitan approach, epitomized by a tendency to sort of universalize suffering and victimhood on the part of both soldiers and civilians. This anti-heroic approach is stressed by the fact that uniforms of the soldiers are displayed horizontally below the level of the museum floor, along with weapons and other objects of the soldier's kit, representing or illustrating life at the front. And we felt that this emphasized the vulnerability and suffering of soldiers. And you see a French example here, but in other pits in the same room, there are uniforms and kits from the British and German armies and colonial troops as well. The exhibition, though, pays limited attention to perpetration. There are weapons and artillery and so on, as you can see in the picture here, but these are displayed near to or in juxtaposition with objects relating to field medicine and physical suffering again, rather than next to the uniforms of the soldiers who would have operated the weapons. Likewise, at the Courville Museum in Slovenia, this museum also favours a cosmopolitan approach, communicating a message of peace based on the universal suffering brought about by war. And this message carries right through the exhibition. In the foyer, you can see portraits of soldiers, again, from all sides of the conflict in the region, and military crosses from military cemeteries. In one of the later rooms, there's also images which, again, emphasize the suffering of soldiers. In this case, we've got wounded soldiers. And there's also a prison door from a military prison in the region that includes graffiti, anti-war graffiti, in both German and Italian. But as at the Historiale, perpetration in this museum is largely abstract and depoliticized. Moving on to a Second World War museum at Berlin-Karlshorst, the German-Russian Museum. This museum has a reconciliatory mission and a focus again on victims rather than heroes. And also it favors, again, a predominantly cosmopolitan approach to storytelling. It does include German and Soviet-Russian perspectives on the war or narratives on the war kind of in parallel. But we felt that although there's some contrast between these narratives, they're pretty much sort of resolved. So they're more consensual. The multi-perspectivity here is rather closed off and consensual, to use Hans's phrase from earlier, rather than radical. As a sign of international reconciliation, the museum aims to present a common Russian-German view of 20th century history. So even though there were some controversies within the scientific committee working to put the exhibition together, these are not really, these controversial interpretations aren't actually included in the final exhibition. Like the Historiale, like the Historiale, no, I'll go back, sorry. And the Coburg Museum. The Karlshorst Museum focuses on victims, mainly on the Soviet side, but also on the German side, and it includes a section on the Holocaust. Responsibility for violence in this museum is concentrated very much on narrow political leadership and military leadership, Hitler, Stalin, and their inner circles, with perpetration otherwise remaining fairly depersonalized. Although the knowledge of and approval for and profiteering from Nazi crimes by other members of the German society is tackled to some degree, the involvement of Soviet citizens in Stalinist crimes is not problematized. Another commonality we found across the three museums that I've talked about so far is that they all use the memory of war to underpin narratives and practices of Europeanization and reconciliation. Moving on to Schindler's Factory in Krakow, despite an overall, again, cosmopolitan narrative here, we did notice some antagonistic features where we found here an underlying contrast between nationalized victimhood, Polish and Jewish, which were treated quite separately, and German perpetratorship. So there was a clear distinction here between good and evil, whereby German perpetrators are dehumanized with no other qualities than a kind of inhuman cruelty and hatred. So quite one-dimensional. We did note antagonistic representations elsewhere, a little bit in the Coburg Museum that I've already talked about. There's some rooms relating to Slovenian national history in there. And we thought that some elements of that part of the exhibition did undermine the overall cosmopolitan message of peace and reconciliation in the rest of the museum. So the persistence of antagonistic modes of remembrance should lead future researchers to pay close attention to them and not assume that that they're behind us. Indeed, beyond the 5 case study museums that we're presenting here, we also noted, or some of our work package members noted, examples of antagonistic representations in war museums in Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and the UK. Moving on, agonistic features we could find in a couple of the 5 permanent exhibitions that we analysed, and most prominently in the Military History Museum in Dresden. This museum has 2 different kind of circuits or routes through the museum that are proposed, one chronological and one thematic. The offering of these 2 different courses itself is one element of a multifaceted, multi-perspectivity at the museum, and that underpins the overall discourse. There are other ways in which it achieves this, for example, through the juxtaposition of objects to open up different views on aspects of the history of war. So, for example, here we have a V2 rocket in the museum that appears in a thematic display on the military and technology. of course, from the Second World War, but just upstairs, it's a very tall object, and just upstairs in the thematic display on children at war, I think, there's a little doll's house from the UK which has windows blacked out and taped up, to protect them from an air raid bomb blast. And also downstairs again in the military and technology section next to the V2 rocket, there's a small metal bowl that would have belonged to a concentration camp prisoner where the rocket was manufactured. So this ensemble, if you like, draws attention to the damaging effect of the weapon and to the fact that it was produced by slave labour, but also to the fact that it was a great example of progress technologically. At the German-Russian Museum in Karlshorst again, we noticed a little sort of suggestion of agonism here in the way that the entrance hall and the first exhibition room are dedicated to diverging memories between German and Russian, or even German and Soviet, or contemporary Russian, and even East and Western German memories and interpretations of the end of the war. Represented, for example, by the different dates that are remembered. So this hints to a memory conflict. However, we felt that in both these museums and others where there may have been small steps towards agonism, the potential in general does not unfold to the full. Rather, the agonistic tendencies are flattened out by an overall cosmopolitan framing. We did feel that, like Pozzi, that there could be more potential for agonistic exhibitions in temporary exhibitions. Museums may have more freedom to explore more controversial approaches in temporary exhibitions. For example, this exhibition took place at Karlshorst about a year ago, and different wars problematized the differences in World War II narratives from Czech, German, Italian, Polish, Lithuanian and Russian school textbooks. Moving on to our visitor studies, preliminary findings point to the success of the cosmopolitan narrative in impressing on visitors the intended meaning of the museums and generating the feeling that war produces only victims and suffering. For instance, most visitors interviewed at the Historial readily acknowledged the cosmopolitan features of the museum discourse, and indeed positively. And many of them stated that everybody was a victim, I think. Oh, that's a different one. Many of them stated that everybody was a victim. Visitors at the Coburg Museum, these come from the visitor books, revealed that the cosmopolitan approach also elicited explicit anti-war messages. I mean, not 100%, but this is an overall trend. And aroused feelings of compassion and revulsion from most of the visitors independently of their nationality. So this focus on the case study museums on victimhood rather than perpetratorship may blind visitors to the mechanisms which lead to the escalation of violence, and they may promote an all too simple identification with victims. Results from the visitor studies at the Historial and Coburg, there's one from the Historial in the middle there, show that when they were questioned about the perpetrators, they responded in very general terms. All perpetrators were difficult to identify. In the case of the Karlshorst Museum, visitors only referred to high-ranking members of the Nazi or Soviet leadership. At Schindler's factory, Nazis or Germans more generally were identified as perpetrators, but they seem to be thought of in a one-dimensional, depersonalized way. So thus, as we conclude in our report that Zofia referred to, it does seem that the cosmopolitan approach struggles to engage with antagonism, as it tends to ignore the latter's construction of the enemy. Nor does it really provide a more complex understanding of war and perpetratorship. Overall, our study seems to confirm a need to move beyond cosmopolitanism in the representation of memories of war, but without, as I can't remember if it was Stefan said, without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So cosmopolitan still provides powerful counter-narratives to antagonistic representations. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, first of all, I would like to thank very, very much everybody, the organizers, but especially Anna, for this very, very welcome invitation, which allows me to think together with you on some issues that have been my main concern in the last year of my research, which was done mainly in Latin America. So I think to bring into the picture a different historical and geographical situation could be very useful to compare the model and to compare different problems, and also to see what works in one context and what can be difficult in another context in some way. I had another project with Chile and Argentina, and now I'm in charge of a project within the RISE model, so it's an exchange project with Argentina, Colombia, and Holland, the Netherlands. And Colombia is a new territory for me. I think can be very interesting because in Colombia they are just thinking now how to memorize their very traumatic past of a civil war for over 20 years, so it would be a kind of experimental. I have not worked so far within the framework of cosmopolitan, antagonistic, and agonist, but I try to reframe my funding within this framework in order to make possible a comparison of our results. It's very clear from now and also from the last talk that we are talking about ideal models and all the concrete cases. I'm not talking about the theory of cosmopolitan as was done this morning, but I'm talking about the installation in real space object like museums, sites of memory, and so on, which is a different level of analysis. And of course, working on museum, working on site of memory, we can see that the models really overlap and intertwine a lot. I never met a pure instance of one of these three models, but that's something that has already been said. So what are the main problems I face with this approach in my case studies? Well, I think the agonistic model, which is something in principle very, very nice, is rooted in the cases of the UNREST project, which is basically an European framework. As was said this morning by Stefan, is inherent, the agonistic model is inherent in some kind of left-wing positioning, assuming that it can win against, or it can do something against the antagonistic model, which is something taken as the populistic, sovereignistic, maybe fascist, nationalist, right-wing model. So my question is, what happens when the antagonistic model is really left-wing and is really the model that the left is working on their own memory, which is very much the case in Latin America, for some good, some understandable historical reason. So I will start with some example. One example is from Chile, and is the beautiful museum that was built under the government of Bachelet, so under the government of the left wing in Chile. And the name is Museum of Memory and Human Rights. So the human rights are there from the very beginning, and the museum, I think, is a very good example of the combination of the cosmopolitan and the antagonistic model. It was said before that even in Europe you find very often some kind of combination between two models. Well, the Santiago Museum is a perfect example of this. You enter, and before entering the real museum, you are in a huge hall, which is the hall of the human rights. There is a map of the whole world with all the points where human rights have been violated, and within that, the violation in Chile. So the frame of interpretation to read that museum is really this cosmopolitan, everybody is suffering for human right violation, although we know that the violation in different parts of the world are very different violation not in terms of the violation, but in terms of the reason, the political, geographic, and so on reason of that. So then you enter the museum, and the museum the first floor is devoted to the coup d'etat of the Golpe in 1973 by the military. Amazingly beautiful in terms of the documents, but there is not a single explanation of why the coup d'etat happened. Now, what is more interesting is that that was precisely the main reason of criticism on the right-hand position in Chile. They said, well, this museum does not explain history because there are no contextualization. And that is absolutely right. So in a way, that museum is an example of depoliticizing history, because victims are just victims and they are deprived of their political identity. And nobody's really said that they were victimized because they were political opponents. So the right was right, in a way, and the left said, no, we don't have to explain the reason of the militaries. And I had terrible discussion with them, saying, listen, to contextualize doesn't mean to say that when the coup d'etat happened, Chile was really in a mess. We know it was in a mess, people did not have what to eat. But you can, what does it mean contextualize? You can go a step behind that and explain that the terrible situation in Chile was really the result of a terrible political fight between the only attempt in the world I am aware of making a real social reform in terms of political and economical anti-liberalism economy and democratic assumption. I think Allende was the only one in the world who tried to combine these two things, and he lost. But he lost because all the high class in Chile and the United States boycott and prevent any possibility of success. So you can contextualize in many different ways. Not that contextualization is neutral, but they did not want, and they said, well, the idea that you have to explain the Golpe is only a right-wing idea, which of course I didn't agree, but that is really what they believe. So, in my opinion, I like the idea of agonistic position, but because I thought a lot, I didn't have the word agonistic, but I thought a lot, how can we find a third position between this neutralization, which is not that cosmopolitan is necessarily is a neutralization, as we heard this morning, but in the way in which is used in the museum, as far as my experience in Latin America, is a neutralization. On the other hand, you have this antagonist position, which is not satisfying either. I take the main feature of the agonistic model as problematizing, therefore introducing controversial multi-perspective. But to introduce multi-perspective position means one very difficult thing, and we should be aware of that. It means to cope, to deal with perpetrator's voice. That's the point which I found very complicated and very difficult, because how can you include and deal with the voice of perpetrators without taking the risk of downplaying, minimizing differences? And if we don't minimize difference and we take a stance, then
we enter into an antagonistic position very easily. I mean, I found this a very theoretical, difficult point, because it's much easier not to deal with perpetrators. I can give you another very interesting example about Argentina. In Argentina, the right-wing discourse model around the historical explanation of the dictatorship is the so-called theory of the two devils. Two devils are the Montoneros and all the terrorist group on one hand, and the military on the other hand. So ironically enough, is a way of neutralizing the difference, which is almost parallel and opposed to the cosmopolitan way. Cosmopolitan model tends in museum, not in general, but in museum, tend to neutralize the differences, saying all were victims, all suffered. The two devils model neutralized the difference, saying, well, they were all terrorists, they were all bad, terrorists and military. But, of course, there is a big difference. One were small group of terrorists, the other was state terrorism. And state means army, apparatus, legal control, whatever. So you can't really compare the two form of violence, because they were completely different violence. One was state violence. They killed and made disappear 30,000 people. The evil is not only a matter of quantity, but is also a matter of quantity. So the ESMA, I don't know if you know what the ESMA is the Escuela Militar de la Armada, which is it was a huge compound in Buenos Aires, with 18 huge buildings, which was a school, a military school, and was where one of the main, maybe the main center of torture was hosted, which was exactly in the building where the officers were living. So the officers were living in one floor, beyond, underneath, and upstairs there were torture rooms. And after the end of the dictatorship, the whole compound was preserved with the idea of making a huge place of memory. The debate, which went on for years about what to do of this place, which was not only the strict place where the torture happened, which is now a site of memory, the Museum of Memory, but all the other buildings, is very, very interesting, because it shows very different models of memory. All the important actors were involved. The mother, the association of the mother, the association of the relatives of the victim, the survivor, the heroes, and many other civilian organization, grassroots organization, non-violent, human rights, and so on and so forth. Each of them had a different idea of what memory should be. The survivors wanted to keep the place exactly as it was, kind of freezing the memory. The mothers want to look ahead and open a school of politics for young people. The heroes wanted to keep the memory of the parents, because rightly enough, they did not know their parents and they want to go inside that. So, and then they decide to do all these things, because each building was given to a different association. There was only one group, 1 over 20, who said we should give voice to the military too. We should not deal with the military only in terms of legal cases and processes and trials. We should somehow work with them, because if we want a real democracy, we have to include the people in the discussion in some way, the people who were against the democracy. They lost completely their battle. This project was voted against by everybody, and there are no traces of the perpetrators in all this huge place. Why? So when we discuss with my new partner, the project I have now is a combined project with academic and non-academic, and the non-academic are all director of memory sites, both in Argentina, in Colombia, and in Amsterdam, and in Italy.
And when we discuss with the director of the ESMA, of the Site of Memory, who is a woman a bit of my age, maybe a bit younger, who was put in prison by the military when she was 17, and we discuss, and my colleagues from Amsterdam tried to make the case of something that he didn't call cosmopolitan model, but was something like that. And she got very angry and she said, no, stop, I don't want to talk about that. We are the victims. They were the perpetrators. This has to remain the ground of everything we do in memory and the way we want to memorize our past. Difficult to object to that. Why? Are the model, the agonistic model, too Eurocentric? Is too sophisticated? Is too European? I don't know. Maybe we could say, well, it's too recent. But if you think in terms of time, okay, Second World War was finished in 75 years ago, but Argentina dictatorship was 40 years ago. So does 30 years make so much difference? I think that's one part of the reason, but the other real part is in the socio-political situation of the country. For a Latin American country, the risk of a new form of, not dictatorship maybe, but fascism is very, very present and very close. And Brazil is a very good or bad lesson for that. Up to 3 years ago, I would have said, well, fascism in Italy is out of the question. Now, I'm not sure. But certainly, for them in Latin America, the idea to stress the antagonistic model with such a strong emphasis is also due to the fact that they feel, I don't know if it's true or not, but they feel that that can be a real, actual problem. So in thinking of model of memory, we should also think of what is felt as a possible threat, a contemporary threat, not only a threat in terms of the past. So, well, just to finish, because I want to leave more, I was very much interested by the observation that was made that the permanent exhibition have more difficulty in dealing with the agonistic. Temporary exhibition can do a bit better, and I would say practices can do even better. And I give you very shortly an example, an Italian example. You might be familiar with what is called the Nazi massacre of Marzabotto. Marzabotto is a small place not far from Bologna, where actually no massacre happened, because the massacre happened not far in a place called Montesole, but in Marzabotto nobody was killed. Why the massacre became the massacre of Marzabotto? Well, because they, after a few years from the liberation, they had to make a commemoration. There was no place to make the commemoration in Montesole. Montesole was a rural area which was all with some houses, so it was not a good place to make a commemoration, so they chose Marzabotto, which is a real village, so it became the massacre of Marzabotto, but that's a parenthesis. So in Montesole they rebuilt the ruins of the house, but that's another problem. And then there is a center, a peace school. And what they do is amazing, because they make work with school, with young people. And in the morning, they do the visit of the place. Then in the afternoon, they make a session. And they try to discuss with the young people why the Nazi did that. And that, I think, is a very good way to embed, in a way, the perspective of persecutor, because they try to make a situation where young people, adolescent, can understand how can happen that you become such evil, not that you are, but that you become. And for example, I assist one of these sessions where the very good lady who is leading this group took the example of mobbing in high school, and it become clear that there were episodes of mobbing, and some of the young people did not agree with the mobbing, but they didn't dare to oppose themselves. And so, in a very natural way, she made a link, of course, mobbing, to oppose to mobbing is not the same thing of the Nazi, but the mechanism is very much the same. And these young people understood that the root of fear, fear of authority, fear of the group pressure, which is one of the main reasons why people can do terrible things, was inside them, not because it's innately inside, but because a certain set of circumstances can make you something that you don't think you are. That's a possibility. The other possibility I would like to explore, but I will not now, is art. I feel very much, I think in a way that art can be a good way to deal with an agonistic perspective, but I don't know why. So I would like in the discussion that you explain me why art can be a solution. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello. Sorry. First of all, thank you, Eleanor and Zofia, for your cogent presentations and for sharing your results with us. It's a pleasure for me to comment on your great work and also to follow up on Professor Violi's comments and fantastic insights about your project. I also want to thank the UNREST project for inviting me, particularly Nina Parish and Aishka Sene for extending the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very much an outsider to this project. Most of you don't know me. My name is Mathieu Viau-Courville. I represent the journal Museum International, published by the International Council of Museums, and also by extension Fontys University in the Netherlands, where I'm based, and leading a research track on museums and creative societies. Whoops, sorry. I haven't prepared any formal presentation or text. I just wanted to take you through some of the ideas. Some of the ideas that I had going through your presentation, your texts, and also through this project more broadly, the different sectors of the project. And I'll try to keep this short. I know I have 10 minutes. I know I have soon a very angry mob, a famished angry mob, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. So I'd like to preface my comments by saying, by perhaps following up on some of the comments this morning, to point to the global resonance of this work, of this kind of work on museums. This was, as pointed out by Professor Violi, it was also relevant to the mass graves that we saw this morning. It was pointed out by Professor Ferrándiz, I think. Sorry. While we're dealing with museums of 20th century museums, they're deeply ingrained in European trauma. They are representing traumas that are very much open today. There are these wounds that just won't heal. It's very much, as it was hinted this morning, it's this past that just won't pass. But there's also, as Professor Berger had also mentioned in the previous conference, there's also this anthropological take to this project that gives it an international, a global application. It's been commented that this project has an application in Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, where you also have these wounds that are very much open today. So this anthropological take of war and human existence, and war being part of that, as it was mentioned in the last conference. But this also brings out the fact that this kind of work is relevant to museums themselves, museum practice, and very much museum policy development. And this is where my comments are mostly framed within. So museums and heritage policy. And I will limit my comments to this sort of framework. Because this project very much touches upon some of the core topics that we're addressing today in terms of policy development. Yes, it is the representation of past trauma and past conflict, but it's also very much about how museums tackle or avoid talking about difficult histories, and what we refer today also sometimes as the hot topics in heritage. So, for example, as a Canadian, having worked in the National Museum in Canada, I very much recognize some of the cosmopolitan models, some of the agonistic models of exhibition making that we've been dealing with. For example, working on projects not only about, but for and with First Nations, for example, in Canada. So this is very much a project that has a global take. But for me, the main takeaway from Eleanor's and Zofia's project is the visitor dimension, the visitor studies dimension. And this is quite, I don't have a presentation, but this is quite very nicely illustrative of that. Because it allows us to dive into these key issues about visitor dynamics, organizational structure in museums, museum content, how it's being developed, but also how visitors actually respond to and behave around the content that we try to provide and try to develop. So visitor studies, this is what I want to focus my comments on for three main reasons. We'll try to structure my comments around that, which you can synthesize as the diplomacy, neutrality, and then meaning making, let's say, or the agency of visitors themselves. Okay, so I'll try to be brief around that. But before so, a small note on what Eleanor and Zofia have been very careful in pointing out, and I very much agree in that, yes, this is a limited sample in the museums, 5 museums we have here, limited sample perhaps on the quantity of visitors that were included in the data. I would also argue that war museums are also a very specific kind of museum within the broader museum world. But even so, it is by narrowing the field, it is by looking at these very specific case studies that this project is able to tackle some of the thorniest issues in museums today. And they contribute, at least from a policy development, into all these ideas that we're trying to figure out. The International Council of Museums, all its subcommittees, ICOM, ICOM being the museology subcommittee, ICME, the Museum of Ethnography subcommittees, everybody's thinking about the future of museums. What is the 21st century museums? What do they look like? And how can we define them? And the work here allows us to very tangible ideas about it, perhaps some very tangible solutions of where we're heading. So I'll come back to this idea of 21st century museums. But one of the first elements that really struck me, looking at some of the preliminary results and the work that was being done in the museums, is the subordination of diplomacy over exhibition narratives, the political side of it. Now, this is something we all know. The political inflections of museums are well studied, well shown. There's no such thing as a politically neutral or apolitical museum. That's been well established. But it's this element of sacrificing narratives for, I think it was called foster diplomatic encounters, which I found fascinating. It's something we all know, but seldom talk about in the sense of the effects this has on our relationship with the visitors and communities, etc., the effects this has on the actual museum work itself. And here we have very tangible, concrete, actually counter effects of what this has in terms of our reality into the policy development. We know, for example, that based again on what I had the pleasure of reading, this very much confirms how this blocks the development of new narratives in museums for many different ways. They undermine key figures in the museum organization, advisory boards, curators, etc., etc. This we know. And this leads to the all too familiar toned down, diluted sometimes narratives based on, is it too much compromise? These are some of the questions. But also this ultimately leaves little room for community engagement. These are all elements that we know, and that we see some of the dynamics here from this project. And of course, this opens the door to some of the great solutions also that we're going to be seeing this afternoon through the presentations of the different representatives from these museums. But this brings me to the question of neutrality itself. A main challenge to policy development over, let's say, the past 10 or even 20 years has been that, yes, while on one side you have great policies and conventions like the UNESCO Convention for Intangible Cultural Heritage that has been fantastic for mending fences, cross-border cooperation, and political strategies of which museums have been very much involved with. But this has been very difficult to link with visitors and the reality of visitors themselves. All right? Now, many studies in Europe, but also in North America, they've shown consistently that museums, very broadly defined, including libraries, etc. as well, museums are very much the last refuge, the last bastion of neutrality. It's where, to most perceptions of visitors and audiences, going to a museum is where you can most expect to gain, let's say, a neutral objective, where you go to learn from an encyclopedic point of view. Now, this can be fantastic. I mean, museums have been working hard to nuance this perception. This can be fantastic on the one hand because we live in an age of fake news, ever-growing generation of post-digital visitors, etc., etc. This can be a very nice tool. But on the other hand, from projects that we did, some data we have, visitors remain very often completely oblivious of some of the political elements of museum work. I think some of the data points to that as well. Visitors are sort of having trouble going beyond the exhibition itself. This is something that was very interesting. I was very interested in seeing in the data that beyond the exhibition itself, the message, we still have a lot of work to do to sense it, for visitors to understand the complexities around the political work that's being done around the exhibitions, and the political agendas of museums themselves. Now, this is not only necessarily a bad thing. Look at even some of the work that's been done in these projects about translation, for example. That was published by Eleanor and Nina Parrish and one of their colleagues, sorry, I don't have a, Marianne Deganuti, about the whole translation process behind the exhibition. Now, that's something that often for visitors is very difficult to grasp and contributes in there's an opportunity to have a greater context of museum work for visitors that is being, I don't want to say denied, but there's an opportunity here for us to develop a greater context, let's say, where the exhibitions are presented, where in the sense of what museum and what is the broader political context of this museum. And for me, I would very much argue that this is a cosmopolitan effect in itself. There's almost a moralizing effect there. Not the visitors not having the opportunity to go beyond or to understand the political context where museums operate. But I'm telling you this very quickly because I have 10 minutes and I want to be as much provocative as possible. So museums have been trying to deconstruct what in your paper, I'm not sure you presented it this morning, but it was presented this morning, this nice model of producers, products, and recipients. So museums, because of this element of neutrality, because of this element of political element, have tried very much to deconstruct this model. The UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage has made recipients, has tried to make recipients into products. The local communities as being producers of the contents, as being part of the products themselves. There's this deconstruction going on in museums, which I think would be very relevant here to try to attempt, well, I've seen some great examples, obviously, that Eleanor and and Zofia have analyzed through their fieldwork and worked with the museums. But this basic model is trying to spin it around. For example, in Brazil, in Vietnam, more and more museums have tried to put the work of the actual curators, the producers of the exhibitions, as part of the exhibition itself, as part of the products. This is a way to try to deconstruct and include different voices as well into the museum. So there's very much an attempt to be bold, to be ambitious about the museum of the 21st century in this way, in this deconstructive way. Which leads me to the last point. The learning patterns. Based on some of the data, again, that we're seeing, war museums seem to follow trends that we're also seeing in other kinds of museum organizations. Historical houses, for example, regional museums, perhaps even eco-museums, in that they seem to struggle to go beyond their core audiences. We know, and in fact, I don't know if this is really representative of your final analysis of the visitor study that you're conducting, but we know that 40, 50 plus generations are those who more positively respond to linear exhibitions. From point A to point B, they appreciate having a clear message stated and to follow this clear narrative. Whereas you have a new core audience, the millennials, for example, who, based on other studies, seem to be the complete opposite sometimes. They most appreciate being given the tools to draw their own conclusions based on open narratives and multi-perspective work. This opens the door again to where is this type of museum heading towards. There's this core audience coming up. The millennials, they're your audience of tomorrow. So how museums are being, when at the time of changing your narrative style, how much can we try to get younger audiences? Should museums today, or are museums today, targeting 40, 50 plus generations for a reason? Probably also. But there's also room to rethink of that 21st century museum through the inclusion of the challenge of including these open narratives, which we know, at least we hypothesize, are much more the thing of a generation, the next generation perhaps, of war museums. So this opens the door again to this idea that it's very much about your non-publics today as well. I think from some of the previous data you've shown, some of the youngest visitors were maybe late 20s, early 30s, or something like this. You have a huge chunk of non-publics available to you. Non-publics either not visiting the museum, not relating their realities to the museums. How can we include this? And what is the proportion of these visitors, your core audiences today, or the proportion of your core non-publics? How much are they actually from the new antagonistic groups? I very much agree with what was said this morning, by Professor Elisabeth Anstett, that I do believe that if museums are to affect change, at some point you have to include those who do not share the same ideas as you. This is a huge challenge, I know. How much of millennials are part of that new neo-antagonistic ideas? How much should they be included? Are they being included at the moment? How many of those 40, 50 plus generations are the visitors that most share what you don't share personally in terms of ideas? If museums are to be inclusive, and that's what all museums are working for, inclusive, open to society, representing society, I really do believe that at some point you have to work with those groups that don't share the same ideals as you. It's extremely complicated to do. Maybe, again, it's through temporary exhibitions, artwork. We all know that if you want to tackle a very hot topic in a museum, especially in an exhibition that's permanent, hire an artist. We know that visitors will see it as an idea in passing, not necessarily part of the museum. It's the artist that thinks that. Is that a strategy? I don't know. But there's elements around the exhibition itself that need to be thought of to include. If the hypothesis here, if it's inferred that agonistic museums can play a role in a more nuanced world, well then at some point we need to include those who we more, the dissonant communities somewhere and somehow. These were my comments for I think I haven't passed the 10 minutes, but that was what I thought was fascinating about your work. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So we have 5-10 minutes for some questions, and I think if I've understood correctly, Eleanor and Zofia are happy to say a few concluding remarks if need be. So any questions, responses? Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I have one question. I find that very interesting. Did you not think of going to try something like the topography of terror or Buchenwald or Sachsenhausen or some of the sites where I think perpetrators are now represented in one form or another? That was the first question.
Do you want to answer directly?
Unless there are other questions, then we will
And maybe I can pick up Patrizia's point about art and agonism, which I think is a fascinating one, and also one that I think we in the UNREST project often puzzled about. And I'm not sure I can give a kind of comprehensive answer to this, but maybe we should also come back to that in the final discussion, because it is intriguing that so many of the sites we looked at, the most agonistic interventions were interventions through art. And I wonder whether it has something to do with the fact that art not only allows, but is sort of based on what perhaps could be called a kind of emotional appeal, that it sort of is working towards the emotions in a far more direct way than the kind of scientific assumptions that certainly much of history, my own profession, still labors under. And of course, in scientific discourse, or the kind of scientificity that we probably mistake for scientific discourse, is actually actively discouraging emotion. You know, emotion disqualifies you in terms of being a scientist. And I think that is a problem for our understanding of science. And therefore, the scientific voices we encounter in museums are probably struggling with agonism because they are struggling to engage with the emotions, whereas the artwork does not. That is only sort of, I'm sure, a tiny fragment of a possible answer to the very big question that you raise.
Can I just abuse my position here and add a comment to that about the art? Because one thing that we discuss quite a lot on the project too is that we're very open to artistic discourses within the museum space, but they can be quite elitist as well. There's a language of art that can, it's the communities that you were talking about, Mathieu, bringing these people in. I don't think it's contemporary art or art that's necessarily going to do that. So that's an interesting point as well, I think. I don't want to have other answers, other questions. Any other questions, any other comments? I won't make comments on anybody's comments.
An anecdote and a question. Actually, what about museums that are failing, that want to, would like to, but fail in proving to be even cosmopolitan. One of my colleagues told me that when he was finishing his visit of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, he heard actually the man behind him telling to his children, "You know that's what happened to those who don't believe in our Lord Jesus Christ." After the visit. So, okay, that happened. And to what extent what you would like to see operates, actually operates. It's just to prevent keeping our happy ending glasses.
Do you want to answer?
Yeah. So the first question about Buchenwald, so it's not that we didn't take it into account at all. We visited, at least me, I'm based in Berlin at the moment, so obviously I visited both places and I even made quite a thorough analysis of the new Buchenwald exhibition. So we are very aware that there are exhibitions which are also introducing in a very interesting way this topic of perpetratorship. We had some criteria for our selections, which maybe I didn't mention. It was that we also think, first we wanted to have a broad spread of countries, so we had already Dresden, but we also looked at exhibitions which are clearly aimed at international visitors and which at least in a way strive to tell the history from a sort of international or European perspective. So, so for example in Perón and Kobarid, it's clear in Kobarid, though it's a kind of local Slovenian team which established the exhibition, but it was from the beginning clear that it was addressed to Slovenian but also to Italian visitors, because it's at the Italian border and is sort of a tool of reconciliation in a way, also attracting. In Perón you have an international curatorial team. In Karlshorst, it's from the kind of very beginning on an international or bilateral Russian-German project. In Schindler it's a bit different, but it's clear that they have this sort of approach. First it's a place of a German hero, the Schindler's factory, but then they try to tell, which is quite interesting and not so, well, something particular in Poland, that it tries to tell both the kind of Jewish story and the non-Jewish Polish story in one place. And then, we had certain criteria where Buchenwald maybe was not fitting in so much, but we did take it into consideration as a sort of secondary case studies, bearing them in mind. Yeah, but yes, yeah, sure, but we also wanted to see how it really functions, this model, and how far it applies this agonistic elements. But we are very well aware that there are other exhibitions.
They would be mainly cosmopolitan, and then actually it was a finding. In fact, for some museums it was a finding that they had a diplomatic reconciliatory role. Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to just take up 2 points very quickly raised by our discussants and Elisabeth. So about practices, first of all, I agree that practices can go beyond what museums are very static, obviously, and practices can be more promising and more dynamic. But museums are also venues for practices, and I've been looking at education practices in First World War museums, including the Historiale and in Flanders Fields, where they offer really interesting opportunities, workshops and things like that for school children, where the young people can take on different perspectives. The problem is, of course, that not many schools take up the opportunity of doing the workshops. I've been looking at British schools, and very, very few of them ever apply to do a workshop there. And the other point, I think, was just about the different publics in museums, and just to point out these interviews we did at the Historiale. We went in September, and it was just at the end of the school holidays, and most of our respondents were over 50, even this example on the screen from the Historiale, it seemed to come from the respondent's prior knowledge. He identified the perpetrators according to prior knowledge. So there's a couple of things there, like yes, even our sample was small, but even within that sample, because of the time of year we visited, it was also further kind of limited or selected. But then there's no kind of accounting for what the visitor also brings with them and how they interpret what they see. And just to close with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, was it? So I read somewhere, and I'm afraid I can't remember the citation, but I read about a Christian school or group visiting this museum and specifically being taught pretty much the same message that you just mentioned. Yeah. So you can't. I mean, the museums. I don't know how they, how they can counter that really. But yeah, it's an issue.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.